The wasteland of Blood of Sanguinius knew no mercy. Beneath twin suns that scorched the irradiated sands, the tribes of humanity's remnants scratched out existence among the ruins of a world long dead. This was where the boy who would become Dante first drew breath, born into a reality where survival meant constant struggle against radiation storms, mutant predators, and the endless competition for scarce water and food. The tribes that roamed these toxic deserts were savage by necessity, their culture shaped by 10,000 years of degradation, since the Age of Strife had reduced Baal's system to a graveyard of worlds. The boy's tribe moved with the seasons such as they were, following ancient migration patterns between the least lethal zones of the moon's surface. Radiation readings that would kill an unprotected human within hours were simply the background reality of existence here. The tribe's masks, crude assemblies of scavenged materials and treated hides, provided minimal protection against the worst of the fallout. Life expectancy rarely exceeded 3 decades, and those who survived that long bore the scars of constant exposure, growths, lesions, and the subtle mutations that marked Blood of Sanguinius's children. Yet even in this hell, the tribes maintained their traditions. They told stories of angels who descended from the sky, golden-winged warriors who selected the worthy from among the strongest youth. These were not myths or legends to comfort the desperate. Every generation, the sky would split with the thunder of drop ships, and the blood angels would come to claim their tithe of aspirants. For a tribal youth, this represented the only escape from a short, brutal existence, though the path they offered promised suffering that made the wasteland's hardships seem trivial by comparison. The boy who would be Dante distinguished himself early through the qualities that mattered in the wastes. He possessed quick reflexes honed by hunting the scorpions and rad lizards that infested the rocky outcrops. His endurance allowed him to march for days with minimal water, and his eyes could spot the telltale signs of an approaching radiation storm before the tribe's crude instruments registered the danger. More than physical prowess, he demonstrated an intuitive understanding of tactics during the inevitable conflicts with rival tribes over territory and resources. When raiders struck, he positioned himself to maximum advantage, using terrain and timing rather than simple aggression. When the Blood Angels came, the boy stood among dozens of aspirants from various tribes, all gathered at one of the ancient rally points marked by weathered monuments from before the fall. The Adeptus Astartes who oversaw the selection were terrifying figures, their crimson armor gleaming impossibly clean against the filth and decay of Blood of Sanguinius. They spoke of the trials ahead with neither encouragement nor sympathy. Most aspirants would die. Those who survived would be transformed into something beyond human, warriors in service to the Emperor and inheritors of Sanguinius's legacy. The first trial began immediately. The aspirants were directed toward the Angel's Path, the treacherous route across the most lethal stretches of Blood of Sanguinius, toward the fortress monastery that dominated the primary world of Baal. No supplies were provided. No guidance was offered beyond a direction. The weak fell within the first day, their bodies unable to process the concentrated radiation of the deep wastes. Others succumbed to the predators that stalked the groups of aspirants, seeing them as convenient prey. Tribal rivalries flared into violence as desperation mounted, and the Blood Angels did nothing to intervene. This was the first culling, separating those with the raw survival instinct required from those who merely possessed bravado. The boy endured. When others panicked during a radiation storm, he found shelter in a collapsed structure and waited out the worst of the fallout. When a mutant ambush scattered his group, he fought with calculated precision rather than wild fear, targeting weak points and using a scavenged blade with efficiency born of wasteland experience. He learned to identify which other aspirants could be trusted for temporary alliances and which would turn on their fellows at the first opportunity. The journey took weeks, and by the time the survivors reached the fortress monastery's outer precincts, fewer than 1 in 10 remained. The fortress monastery itself was a structure beyond the comprehension of tribal youth. Towering spires of adamantium and ceramite rose from Baal's surface, their architecture speaking to an age of wonder and power that the wasteland tribes could barely imagine. Here, the true trials began. The aspirants faced tests of strength, endurance, and mental fortitude that made the crossing of Blood of Sanguinius seem merely preparatory. They fought each other in controlled combat, were subjected to psychological examinations by the chapter's chaplains and endured physical challenges designed to push them to the absolute limits of human capability. Through it all, the boy demonstrated not just the physical attributes required, but the mental qualities the Blood Angels sought. He adapted quickly to instruction, showing none of the rigid tribal thinking that crippled other aspirants when faced with new concepts. When presented with tactical scenarios, he displayed an intuitive grasp of strategy that caught the attention of the training sergeants. His performance in the trials was not flawless. He bore injuries and made mistakes, but he showed the capacity to learn from failure and adjust his approach accordingly. The final selection saw him among a handful chosen to receive the gene seed. The transformation from human to Adeptus Astartes was an ordeal that tested aspirants in ways no physical trial could match. The process began with the implantation of the secondary heart, the first of the 19 organs that would remake his body. Each implantation brought fever, pain, and the risk of rejection. The boy's body, already hardened by life on Bal Secundus, accepted the organs with fewer complications than many aspirants experienced, though the process was never easy. The gene seed of Sanguinius carried within it both transcendent gifts and terrible curses. As the transformation progressed, the aspirant felt the first stirrings of the red thirst, that overwhelming urge for blood and violence that haunted every son of the great angel. During the implantation of the omophagia, the organ that allowed a space marine to gain information by consuming flesh, the thirst nearly overwhelmed him. The apothecaries and chaplains who oversaw the process watched carefully for signs that the aspirant would succumb, ready to end the transformation if the flaw proved too strong. He endured, though the struggle left him shaking and his mind scarred by visions of violence that seemed to come from outside himself. The hypnotherapy and psycho-conditioning that accompanied the physical transformation worked to create the mental architecture of a space marine. The boy's identity as a tribal youth was not erased, but rather incorporated into a new framework of loyalty, duty, and tactical knowledge. He learned the history of the Blood Angels, their battles and triumphs spanning 10 millennia since the Great Crusade. He absorbed the teachings of the Codex Astartes, the strategic doctrines that guided space marine warfare. Most importantly, he came to understand what it meant to be a son of Sanguinius, bearing both the pride of that lineage and the burden of the chapter's genetic curse. His emergence from the transformation marked the beginning of his service in the Scout Company. Here, newly made battle brothers learned the practical application of their training before receiving their power armor and full status within the chapter. Scout duty on Bal meant operations across the radiation-scarred system, hunting mutants and renegades, protecting the tribal populations from the worst threats, and conducting reconnaissance missions that tested their abilities in real combat situations. The young space marine who had once been a tribal boy proved exceptional in the Scout Company. His wasteland experience translated directly to the reconnaissance and survival skills required of scouts, and his enhanced physiology made him far more capable than he had ever been as a human. More significantly, he demonstrated the tactical acumen that would define his later career. During operations, he showed an ability to assess complex situations quickly and make decisions that maximized his squad's effectiveness while minimizing risk. His sergeants noted that he possessed an unusual capacity to think several steps ahead, anticipating enemy responses and positioning his forces accordingly. Combat operations brought him face to face with the realities of the 41st millennium. He fought Orc raiders attempting to establish footholds on Bal Secundus, learning the brutal resilience of the greenskin species. He participated in actions against chaos cultists who periodically emerged from the deep wastes, seeing firsthand the corruption that the ruinous powers could inflict on human souls. Each engagement added to his experience and refined his understanding of warfare in all its varied forms. The red thirst remained a constant challenge. In the heat of battle, when blood was spilled and violence reached its peak, the urge to lose himself in slaughter pulled at his consciousness. The training and conditioning helped him maintain control, but the struggle never ceased. He learned to recognize the warning signs, the way his vision would sharpen and narrow, the way the scent of blood would suddenly dominate all other sensory input. Managing the thirst became as much a part of his identity as his tactical skills, a burden every Blood Angel carried. His progression through the Scout Company was marked by steady advancement and growing responsibility. He led reconnaissance missions into hostile territory, coordinated with other squads during larger operations, and began to understand the broader strategic picture beyond individual engagements. The chapter's veterans recognized in him the qualities that marked a future leader, not just competence in battle, but the ability to inspire confidence in his brothers and make difficult decisions under pressure. When the time came for his elevation to full battle brother status, he had proven himself worthy beyond question. The ceremony that saw him don power armor for the first time and take his place among the chapter's tactical squads marked the completion of his transformation from tribal youth to Adeptus Astartes. He bore the heraldry of the Blood Angels with pride, the winged blood drop that symbolized his chapter's heritage and the legacy of their Primarch. He was no longer the boy from the wastes, but a warrior of the Imperium, ready to face whatever threats the galaxy might present. The centuries that followed his ascension to full battle brother status saw the warrior advance through the ranks of the Blood Angels with a consistency that marked him as exceptional even among the superhuman warriors of the Adeptus Astartes. He served in tactical squads, assault squads, and devastator squads, gaining proficiency with every weapon in the chapter's arsenal. His combat record accumulated victories across dozens of war zones, from boarding actions against space hulks infested with genestealers to planetary campaigns against orc wayags and heretic uprisings. Each deployment added layers to his tactical understanding, and his ability to analyze battlefield conditions and adapt strategies accordingly earned him recognition from the chapter's command structure. Promotion to sergeant came after 2 centuries of service, a rapid advancement that reflected both his capabilities and the constant attrition that ground down even Space Marine chapters. As a sergeant, he commanded squads in some of the Blood Angels' most demanding operations, learning to balance aggression with tactical discipline. The Blood Angels' doctrine emphasized rapid assault and overwhelming force, leveraging their gene-enhanced speed and close combat prowess. Yet he demonstrated an understanding that blind aggression, even when successful, carried costs that could cripple future operations. His squad suffered fewer casualties than average while maintaining operational effectiveness, a combination that brought him to the attention of the chapter's senior leadership. The Red Thirst remained his constant companion, growing more insistent with each passing decade. Combat triggered the worst episodes, when the scent of blood and the fury of melee threatened to overwhelm the conditioning that kept him controlled. He developed personal techniques to manage the urge, focusing on tactical analysis even in the midst of close combat, using the intellectual demands of command to maintain a barrier against the genetic flaw. The chapter's sanguinary priests monitored all battle brothers for signs that the thirst was gaining dominance, ready to intervene if a warrior showed signs of losing himself to the curse. He passed their evaluations, though the struggle cost him in ways that never appeared in official records. His elevation to company captain came after 4 centuries of service, placing him among the chapter's elite commanders. As captain, he commanded 100 battle brothers and bore responsibility for their deployment, training, and welfare. The role demanded skills beyond battlefield tactics. He coordinated with other captains during chapter-wide operations, participated in strategic planning sessions with the chapter master and his advisors, and represented the Blood Angels in dealings with other imperial institutions. The Administratum, the Imperial Navy, the Inquisition, and countless other organizations required careful handling, each with their own protocols, politics, and expectations. He proved adept at navigating these relationships, demonstrating a diplomatic capability that complemented his martial prowess. The chapter master during this period recognized these qualities and increasingly relied on the captain for assignments that required both military skill and political acumen. He commanded Blood Angels forces in campaigns where coordination with other Imperial factions was critical, managing the egos of Imperial Guard generals, the suspicions of Inquisitors, and the rigid protocols of Adeptus Mechanicus tech priests. His ability to achieve objectives while maintaining productive relationships with these varied organizations made him invaluable to the chapter's broader strategic position within the Imperium. The centuries of his captaincy saw the Imperium locked in the grinding conflicts that defined the 40th millennium. Chaos incursions erupted along the Eye of Terror's periphery. Orc empires waxed and waned across the galaxy's eastern reaches. Tyranid Hive Fleets began their inexorable advance into Imperial space, bringing a Xenos threat unlike anything humanity had faced since the Great Crusade. The Blood Angels deployed across these battlefronts, and his company earned distinction in engagements against all these threats. His tactical flexibility allowed him to adjust doctrines for each enemy type, recognizing that the approaches effective against orcs proved suicidal against Tyranids, while chaos required entirely different considerations. The Black Rage haunted the chapter throughout these years. Unlike the Red Thirst, which all Blood Angels struggled to control, the Black Rage was an absolute affliction. Battle brothers who succumbed to it lost themselves entirely, their minds trapped in visions of Sanguinius's final battle against Horus aboard the Warmaster's flagship during the Horus Heresy. These fallen warriors became Death Company, painted black and marked with red crosses, unleashed in battle as living weapons before their inevitable deaths. The captain witnessed brothers fall to the rage, good warriors lost to the genetic curse their Primarch's death had inflicted on his sons. Each loss diminished the chapter's strength, and the knowledge that any Blood Angel might succumb at any moment cast a shadow over even their greatest victories. The circumstances that led to his appointment as chapter master came suddenly, though the chapter had been preparing for the transition for decades. The previous chapter master had served for nearly 8 centuries, an exceptional tenure even by Space Marine standards. Age and accumulated injuries had begun to slow him, and the chapter's senior leadership recognized that succession planning was necessary. Several captains were considered potential successors, each with their own strengths and records of service. The decision ultimately fell to the chapter master himself, guided by consultation with the sanguinary high priest, the master of sanctity, and the chief librarian. The selection reflected both capability and political considerations. The chapter master needed to command respect from the battle brothers while maintaining effective relationships with external imperial institutions. Combat prowess alone was insufficient. The role required strategic vision, administrative competence, and the diplomatic skills to navigate the complex web of imperial politics. The captain who would become Dante possessed all these qualities, demonstrated through centuries of successful command. When the previous chapter master announced his choice, few within the chapter questioned the decision. The formal ceremonies that marked his ascension to chapter master took place within the fortress monastery's Great Hall, beneath the vaulted ceilings decorated with murals depicting the Blood Angels' greatest victories. The assembled battle brothers, representatives from every company, witnessed as he took the oaths of office. He swore to defend the chapter, to honor Sanguinius's memory, to serve the emperor, and to bear the burdens of command until death claimed him or he could no longer fulfill his duties. The sanguinary high priest anointed him with oils blessed by the chapter's holiest relics. The master of sanctity presented him with the symbols of his office, including the ancient power sword that chapter masters had carried since the heresy. The most significant moment came when he donned the golden Death Mask. This ornate artifact, crafted to resemble Sanguinius's features, had been worn by every Blood Angel's chapter master since the Primarch's death. The mask was more than ceremonial regalia. It served as a physical link to Sanguinius, a reminder of what the Blood Angels fought to honor and the perfection they could never achieve. The mask's features captured the Primarch in repose, the serene beauty that had marked Sanguinius even in death. When he placed it over his face, feeling the ancient metal conform to his features through mechanisms no one fully understood, he felt the weight of 10,000 years of history settle onto his shoulders. The mask became synonymous with his identity from that moment forward. He wore it during all formal occasions, in battle, and when representing the chapter to external authorities. The golden face became the public image of the Blood Angel's leadership, instantly recognizable across the Imperium. Battle brothers who served under him reported that the mask seemed to change his presence, lending him an authority that transcended his personal charisma. Whether this was psychological effect or some property of the relic itself remained uncertain, but the impact was undeniable. His early centuries as chapter master established the patterns that would define his extended tenure. He proved to be a defensive-minded strategist, recognizing that the Blood Angel's aggressive doctrine needed tempering with careful resource management. Each battle brother lost represented years of training and irreplaceable gene seed. The chapter's recruitment from Baal's irradiated population provided a steady stream of aspirants, but the transformation process remained inefficient, with high mortality rates among those who received the gene seed. Preserving veteran warriors became a priority, even as the chapter maintained its reputation for devastating assaults. He restructured the chapter's deployment patterns, ensuring that companies rotated through garrison duties at the fortress monastery rather than remaining on campaign indefinitely. This allowed battle brothers periods of rest and retraining while maintaining the chapter's readiness for major operations. The approach was not universally popular. Some captains chafed at being pulled from active war zones, viewing garrison duty as wasted opportunity. He overruled these objections, recognizing that sustained operations without respite led to degraded performance and increased susceptibility to the Red Thirst. His relationship with the sanguinary priests evolved into one of the pillars of his command. These specialized apothecaries bore responsibility for the chapter's genetic health, monitoring battle brothers for signs of the Red Thirst or Black Rage, maintaining the gene seed stocks, and overseeing the creation of new space marines. The sanguinary high priest became one of his closest advisors, providing regular assessments of the chapter's genetic stability. The reports were never encouraging. The rate at which battle brothers fell to the Black Rage showed no signs of decreasing, and some sanguinary priests worried that the flaw was intensifying with each generation. He authorized expanded research into potential treatments or mitigations, though centuries of effort had produced no breakthroughs. The chaplains, led by the Master of Sanctity, provided spiritual guidance and maintained the chapter's traditions. They conducted the rituals that honored Sanguinius, led battle brothers in prayer before combat, and counseled those struggling with the thirst. The chaplains also oversaw the Death Company, ensuring that those who fell to the Black Rage were properly equipped and deployed where their final service could achieve maximum impact. He worked closely with the Master of Sanctity to refine the chapter's spiritual practices, recognizing that faith and ritual provided psychological anchors that helped battle brothers resist their genetic curses. The librarians represented another critical element of chapter leadership. These psychers, trained to harness their abilities in service to the Emperor, provided intelligence gathering, psychic defense, and offensive capabilities that conventional warriors could not match. The chief librarian advised him on threats that existed beyond normal perception, warning of chaos corruption, identifying demonic incursions, and monitoring the warp for signs of approaching danger. He valued the librarian's counsel while remaining aware of the risks psychers posed. The line between sanctioned psyker and corrupted witch was thinner than most imperial citizens understood, and constant vigilance was required to ensure the librarians remained loyal servants of the Imperium. Together, these leaders formed the chapter's command council, advising him on strategic decisions and managing their respective domains. He established regular meetings where they could raise concerns, debate approaches, and coordinate their efforts. The council's discussions ranged from immediate tactical considerations to long-term strategic planning, from genetic research to diplomatic relations with other imperial institutions. His leadership style emphasized consultation and delegation, recognizing that no single individual, even a Space Marine chapter master, could manage every aspect of a 1,000-warrior organization operating across multiple star systems. His reputation as a strategist grew through the successful campaigns he directed during his first centuries as chapter master. He demonstrated particular skill in coordinated operations involving multiple Imperial forces, managing the complex logistics and command structures required when Space Marines, Imperial Guard, and Imperial Navy elements operated together. Several major victories against Orc invasions and Chaos incursions were attributed to his strategic planning and his ability to maintain unity of command despite the fractious nature of imperial military politics. The genetic legacy of Sanguinius manifested in two distinct curses that haunted every son of the Blood Angels and their successor chapters. The Red Thirst represented a constant hunger for blood and violence, an overwhelming urge that lurked beneath the surface of every battle brother's consciousness. Unlike the controlled aggression that defined Space Marine combat doctrine, the thirst pulled warriors toward mindless savagery, threatening to reduce them to blood-mad berserkers. The Black Rage was something far worse, a sudden and absolute affliction that trapped its victims in psychic visions of their Primarch's final moments aboard the Vengeful Spirit, reliving Sanguinius's desperate battle against Horus with such intensity that the present ceased to exist for them. Both flaws stemmed from the trauma of Sanguinius's death during the Siege of Terra, a psychic wound so profound it had scarred the Primarch's gene seed for all time. Dante's relationship with the Red Thirst had evolved across his extended lifespan into something resembling a constant negotiation with his own nature. The urge never disappeared, never weakened with time or familiarity. If anything, the passing centuries had made it more insistent, as though the weight of years accumulated pressure against the mental barriers he maintained. During combat, particularly in close quarters where blood flowed freely, and the sounds of dying filled his enhanced hearing, the thirst would surge with overwhelming force. His vision would sharpen until he could see individual droplets of blood hanging in the air. His sense of smell would narrow to focus entirely on the copper scent of spilled viti, and his thoughts would compress into a singular drive to rend and tear. The techniques he had developed to manage the thirst required constant reinforcement. In battle, he forced himself to maintain tactical awareness even as his body moved through the practiced motions of combat. He tracked enemy positions, assessed battlefield conditions, monitored his battle brother's locations, and planned several moves ahead, using the intellectual demands of command as an anchor against the genetic curse. The Golden Death mask he wore as chapter master served an unexpected function in this struggle. The physical barrier between his face and the battlefield environment provided a psychological buffer, a reminder of his identity and responsibilities that helped him maintain control when the thirst threatened to overwhelm him. Other battle brothers were not so fortunate. Dante watched warriors he had served alongside for centuries gradually lose their struggle against the thirst. The progression followed recognizable patterns. A battle brother would begin showing increased aggression during combat operations, pursuing enemies with more ferocity than tactical sense demanded. The sanguinary priests would note the changes, increasing their monitoring and counseling sessions. Sometimes intervention worked, and the warrior would regain equilibrium. More often, the decline continued. The affected battle brother would start requesting front-line assignments with unusual frequency, seeking out the most dangerous combat zones. His brothers would notice behavioral changes, a tendency toward isolation or conversely an almost manic gregariousness. Eventually, the warrior would either succumb entirely to the thirst or recognize what was happening and request assignment to a penitent crusade, seeking death in service before the curse claimed him completely. The Black Rage represented a different category of horror. Unlike the Red Thirst's gradual pressure, the rage struck suddenly and without warning. A battle brother might be entirely functional one moment, then the next find himself trapped in visions of the Horus Heresy's final hours. The afflicted warrior would believe himself to be Sanguinius, experiencing the Primarch's desperate assault on the Warmaster with complete sensory immersion. They felt Horus's blows crushing their bones, tasted the blood in their mouths, heard the Warmaster's taunts, and the distant sounds of Terra burning below. The present became irrelevant, replaced entirely by a past event that had occurred over 10,000 years earlier. These warriors saw their battle brothers as the Warmaster's corrupted bodyguards, perceived their surroundings as the Vengeful Spirit's corrupted halls, and fought with the desperate fury of a Primarch making his final stand. Dante's role in managing the Death Company had become one of his heaviest burdens as chapter master. The chaplains bore direct responsibility for the fallen warriors, but ultimate authority rested with him. Each battle brother who fell to the rage represented both a personal loss and a tactical problem. The Death Company could not be simply eliminated. They remained capable fighters, perhaps even more dangerous than before their fall due to their complete abandonment of self-preservation. The chapter's tradition dictated that these warriors be given one final opportunity to serve, deployed in situations where their uncontrollable aggression could be directed against the Emperor's enemies. The process of inducting a fallen battle brother into the Death Company followed strict protocols. When a warrior showed signs of succumbing to the rage, the chaplains would be summoned immediately. They would attempt to assess whether the episode was temporary or permanent, though the distinction was usually obvious. A warrior in the grip of the Black Rage did not respond to external stimuli in any coherent fashion. They spoke in fragments, quoting Sanguinius's final words, describing events from the heresy as though they were happening in real time. The chaplains would then escort the fallen warrior to the Reclusiam, where he would be prepared for his final service. The Death Company's armor was painted black, the chapter's color of mourning. Red crosses marked their shoulder plates, signifying their sacrifice and their fallen state. The chaplains equipped them with close combat weapons, recognizing that warriors lost in visions of the Primarch's final battle would instinctively seek melee engagement. Power swords, chain swords, thunder hammers, and other weapons designed for brutal close quarters fighting filled the Death Company's armory. Some fallen warriors retained enough martial skill to be equipped with jump packs, allowing them to be deployed as shock troops who could rapidly close with enemy positions. Dante made the tactical decisions about Death Company deployment. The calculations were grimly practical. These warriors could not be saved, but their deaths could serve strategic purposes. Against heavily fortified positions, where conventional assault would cost numerous casualties, the Death Company provided an alternative. They could be dropped directly into enemy strongpoints, their complete disregard for personal safety allowing them to achieve breakthroughs that would be suicidal for rational warriors. Against chaos forces, particularly those bearing the marks of the War Master's old legion, the Death Company fought with special intensity, as though recognizing their true enemies through the veil of their delusions. The psychological impact of each Death Company deployment weighed on Dante in ways that never appeared in after-action reports. He had served alongside many of these warriors for centuries, fought beside them in dozens of campaigns, shared the bonds that formed between Space Marines who faced death together repeatedly. Watching them march to their final battles, knowing they would not return, knowing they died believing themselves to be their Primarch in his final moments, created a cumulative grief that no amount of conditioning could fully suppress. The chapter's traditions provided frameworks for processing this loss, rituals and remembrances that honored the fallen, but the sheer number of warriors lost to the rage across his extended tenure had created a weight of sorrow that he carried constantly. The search for a cure or mitigation of the gene curse had consumed enormous resources across Dante's leadership. The sanguinary priests conducted continuous research, analyzing gene seed samples, studying the biological mechanisms underlying both the thirst and the rage, and testing potential treatments. The apothecarium maintained detailed records of every battle brother's genetic profile, tracking markers that might indicate increased susceptibility to the flaws. Librarians investigated whether psychic techniques could provide protection or early warning. The chief librarian had theorized that the Black Rage represented a form of psychic imprinting, Sanguinius's death trauma somehow encoded in the gene seed and triggered under specific conditions. If this theory was correct, psychic shielding might offer protection, though practical implementation had proven elusive. Dante authorized collaboration with other Blood Angels successor chapters, sharing research findings and coordinating experimental approaches. The Flesh Terrors, whose gene seed showed particularly severe manifestations of the Red Thirst, provided data from their own studies. The Blood Drinkers shared their techniques for managing the thirst through controlled rituals. The Lamenters, cursed with their own unique misfortunes beyond the standard gene flaws, offered perspectives from their struggles. Despite these collaborative efforts, no breakthrough emerged. The flaws appeared fundamental to the gene seed itself, woven into the genetic code in ways that resisted all attempts at correction. Some sanguinary priests advocated for more radical approaches. They proposed experimental gene therapies that might alter the gene seed's structure, potentially removing or suppressing the flawed elements. Dante rejected these proposals after careful consideration. The risks were enormous. Tampering with Space Marine gene seed carried the potential for catastrophic consequences, possibly creating new flaws worse than those they sought to eliminate. The Adeptus Mechanicus's experience with attempting to improve upon the Emperor's work provided cautionary examples. The cursed founding of the 21st founding had produced chapters with severe genetic instabilities when the Mechanicus tried to correct or enhance gene seed. The Lamenters themselves were products of that founding, their exceptional bad luck possibly linked to whatever modifications had been attempted on their gene seed. Beyond the biological research, Dante focused on practical measures to help Battle Brothers manage the Red Thirst. He expanded the chapter's training programs to include psychological conditioning techniques that reinforced mental discipline. Veterans who had successfully managed the thirst for centuries were assigned to mentor younger Battle Brothers, sharing their personal strategies and providing support during difficult periods. The chaplains increased their counseling services, making themselves available to any warrior struggling with the curse. These measures could not cure the flaw, but they appeared to help some Battle Brothers maintain control longer than they might have otherwise. The Death Company's numbers fluctuated across the centuries of Dante's leadership, but the overall trend was disturbingly upward. Some decades saw only a handful of Battle Brothers fall to the Black Rage. Other periods witnessed dozens succumbing in rapid succession, as though the curse was spreading through the chapter like a contagion. The sanguinary high priest identified certain patterns. Major battles, particularly those involving significant casualties or extreme violence, seemed to trigger increased rates of the rage. Exposure to chaos corruption elevated risk factors. Age appeared to be a contributing element, with older Battle Brothers showing slightly higher susceptibility, though the rage could strike warriors of any experience level without warning. Dante himself remained acutely aware of his own vulnerability. His extended lifespan, unprecedented even among chapter masters, placed him in uncharted territory regarding the gene curse's long-term effects. The sanguinary priests monitored him more closely than any other Battle Brother, conducting regular genetic assessments and psychological evaluations. He submitted to these examinations without complaint, recognizing their necessity. If the chapter master fell to the Black Rage, the consequences would extend far beyond personal tragedy. The political and military implications of the Blood Angels' leader succumbing to the curse would reverberate across the Imperium. His personal struggle with the Red Thirst had intensified as the centuries accumulated. The urge was stronger now than it had been in his first centuries as chapter master, requiring more active effort to suppress. During particularly intense battles, he sometimes felt himself teetering on the edge of losing control, the thirst pulling at him with such force that only the most rigid mental discipline kept him functional. He never spoke of these moments to anyone except the sanguinary high priest, recognizing that any sign of weakness from the chapter master could undermine confidence throughout the chapter. The golden mask helped hide the physical signs of his struggle, concealing the tension in his features and the occasional tremor that accompanied his worst episodes. The warnings arrived in fragments, garbled astropathic transmissions that painted an incomplete picture of the approaching nightmare. Hive Fleet Leviathan, the largest Tyrannid swarm yet encountered by the Imperium, had altered its course. The massive tendril of the Hive Fleet that had been ravaging worlds along the galaxy's southern reaches was now driving directly toward the Baal system. Initial reports suggested numbers beyond anything the Blood Angels had faced in their 10,000-year history. Billions of organisms, perhaps trillions, formed a living tide that consumed every world in its path, stripping planets bare of biomass before moving to the next target. Dante received the intelligence reports in the Fortress Monastery's command center, a vast chamber dominated by hololithic displays that showed the Baal system and surrounding sectors. The strategic situation was immediately clear and deeply troubling. The Tyrannid advance was not a probing tendril or isolated splinter fleet. This represented a concentrated assault by one of the Great Devourer's primary hive fleets, bringing resources and bioforms that could overwhelm conventional defenses through sheer mass. The Xenos organisms would not negotiate, could not be reasoned with, and would not stop until either they consumed everything or were completely destroyed. The Baal system, heart of the Blood Angels' domain and recruitment base for the chapter, stood directly in Leviathan's path. The chapter's initial response followed protocols established over millennia of warfare. Dante ordered the fortress monastery to full combat readiness, activated the system's defense networks, and dispatched urgent astropathic messages to Blood Angels' forces scattered across the Imperium. Every company on deployment received recall orders, though the vagaries of warp travel meant many would not return in time. The chapter's fleet, including the battle barges, strike cruisers, and escort vessels that formed the Blood Angels' void strength, began preparations for the naval engagement that would precede any planetary assault. The Tech Marines oversaw weapons system checks, ammunition stockpiling, and the awakening of ancient war machines that had stood dormant in the fortress monastery's deepest vaults. What transformed the coming battle from a chapter-level crisis into something unprecedented was Dante's decision to call upon the successor chapters. The Blood Angels had spawned numerous successor chapters during the second founding and subsequent foundings, each inheriting portions of Sanguinius's gene seed and carrying forward aspects of the Blood Angels' traditions. The Flesh Terrors, Angels in Carmine, Angels Sanguine, Blood Drinkers, and dozens of other chapters bore the genetic legacy of the Great Angel. Dante's message to these scattered chapters was direct. Baal, the homeworld of their shared Primarch, faced extinction. Every son of Sanguinius was called to its defense. The response exceeded even Dante's hopes. Successor chapters across the Imperium diverted from their campaigns, abandoning ongoing operations to answer the summons. The Flesh Terrors, known for their savage combat doctrine and severe manifestation of the Red Thirst, arrived with their full chapter strength. The Angels Vermilion brought their elite assault companies. The Carmine Blades, the Angels in Carmine, the Angels Sanguine, and chapter after chapter translated into the Baal system, their battle barges and strike cruisers swelling the defensive fleet to numbers not seen since the Horus Heresy. Even chapters that had been reduced to mere handfuls of survivors by previous campaigns sent what forces they could spare, determined to stand with their brother chapters in defense of their shared heritage. The gathering created logistical and command challenges that tested Dante's organizational abilities to their limits. Each chapter master commanded his own forces, maintained his own tactical doctrines, and bore responsibility for his chapter's honor and survival. Coordinating dozens of independent Space Marine chapters, each with their own traditions and command structures, required diplomatic skills as much as military expertise. Dante established a unified command structure with himself as supreme commander, a position the other chapter masters accepted based on his seniority, his intimate knowledge of the Baal system's defenses, and the simple fact that this was the Blood Angels' homeworld. Regular councils brought together the chapter masters to coordinate strategy, allocate defensive sectors, and ensure that the assembled forces operated as a coherent whole rather than a collection of independent warbands. The assembled strength was staggering. Estimates suggested over 30,000 Space Marines had gathered in the Baal system, the largest concentration of Sanguinius's bloodline since the Great Crusade. The combined fleet numbered hundreds of warships, from mighty battle barges equipped with bombardment cannons and Nova cannons to swift strike cruisers and the escort vessels that screened the larger ships. The fortress monastery's armories supplied additional equipment to chapters that had arrived with depleted stocks, sharing ammunition, vehicles, and weapons to ensure maximum combat effectiveness. The Tech Marines from different chapters collaborated on defensive preparations, establishing void shield generators, laying minefields, and preparing the kill zones that would channel the Tyrannid assault into predetermined engagement areas. Baal Secundus, the irradiated moon where Dante had spent his youth as a tribal warrior, became a primary defensive position. The Blood Angels established fire-based complexes across the moon's surface, massive fortifications equipped with macro cannons, defense lasers, and missile silos. The tribal populations were evacuated to underground shelters, ancient bunker systems that dated back to the Age of Strife. Dante walked the trenches and fortifications during the preparation phase, inspecting defensive positions and speaking with the battle brothers who would hold them. He saw warriors from a dozen different chapters working alongside each other, their armor painted in different colors, but all bearing the iconography that marked them as sons of Sanguinius. The Tyranids arrived in a swarm that blotted out the stars. The vanguard organisms, specialized bioforms designed to scout and prepare the way for the main fleet, entered the system first. These creatures, ranging from small spore mines to massive Kraken-class bioships, probed the defenses and transmitted information back to the hive mind through synaptic links. The Blood Angels fleet engaged them at extreme range, using Nova cannons and long-range lance batteries to destroy the scouts before they could gather detailed intelligence. The Void battles were brutal and efficient, the Space Marine fleet's superior firepower and tactics overwhelming the vanguard organisms. But these were merely the first drops of a coming deluge. The main Hive fleet emerged from the void like a living nightmare. Bioships by the thousands, each one a massive organism capable of independent operation, yet linked to the Hive mind's collective intelligence, advanced toward Baal in a formation that suggested terrible purpose. The largest bioships, Hive ships the size of Imperial battleships, formed the core of the fleet. Around them swarmed smaller organisms, Kraken ships that served as heavy assault vessels, Razorfiend ships designed for close combat, and clouds of smaller creatures that filled the void between the larger bioforms. The psychic presence of the Hive mind pressed against the consciousness of every living thing in the system, a pressure that the librarians struggled to shield against. Dante commanded the Void battle from the Fortress Monastery's command center, coordinating fleet movements through constant communication with the various chapter masters and ship captains. The defensive strategy relied on the system's geography. Baal's star system contained multiple planetary bodies, asteroid fields, and the debris of ancient space stations that could be used as defensive positions. The fleet established kill zones at key approach vectors, concentrating firepower to destroy as many bioships as possible before they reached the inner system. The engagement began at ranges measured in hundreds of thousands of kilometers, with lance batteries and bombardment cannons firing across the void at targets identified by augur arrays and psychic detection. The Tyranid fleet absorbed catastrophic losses without deviation from its course. Bioships exploded under concentrated fire, their deaths releasing clouds of smaller organisms that continued advancing toward Baal even as their parent vessels died. The Hive mind's strategy became apparent as the battle progressed. The Tyranids were not attempting to destroy the Space Marine fleet in a decisive engagement. Instead, they sought to overwhelm the defenses through sheer numbers, accepting massive casualties to force their way to the planets where the real biomass existed. For every bioship destroyed, two more advanced to take its place, and the weight of numbers began to tell despite the Space Marine's superior firepower and tactical coordination. The Void battle raged for weeks, a grinding attritional struggle that cost both sides heavily. The Blood Angels and their successor chapters fought with coordinated precision, battle barges and strike cruisers working in squadrons to concentrate fire on priority targets, while escort vessels screened against the smaller organisms that sought to close to boarding range. The Tech Marines performed miracles of battlefield repair, keeping damaged vessels operational through emergency procedures and improvised solutions. But the losses mounted. Strike cruisers were overwhelmed by swarms of smaller organisms that latched onto their hulls and tore through armor plating. Battle barges suffered catastrophic damage from bioplasma weapons that melted through void shields and adamantium hulls. Several ships were lost entirely, their crews fighting to the last as their vessels were consumed by the Tyranid swarm. The Tyranids reached Baal Secundus first, spore pods and mycetic spores raining down on the moon's surface in numbers that saturated the defensive fire. The landing was not a precision insertion, but a biological bombardment, billions of organisms falling from orbit in a living rain. Many died during descent, burned by defense lasers or destroyed by anti-aircraft fire, but the sheer volume of the assault ensured that massive numbers survived to reach the surface. The organisms that made landfall ranged from small hormigons and termagants to massive carnifexes and biotitans, with every size and type of Tyranid bioform represented in the swarm. The ground war began immediately, with no pause or preparation phase. The Tyranid swarm surged toward the Blood Angels' defensive positions in waves that seemed endless. Dante coordinated the ground defense from a command post within the primary fortress complex, receiving reports from across Bal Secundus as the various chapters engaged the Xenos organisms. The fighting was brutal and immediate, with no room for maneuver or tactical finesse. The Tyranids attacked in overwhelming numbers, accepting casualties that would break any conventional army in their drive to close with the defenders. The Space Marines met them with disciplined fire, bolters, heavy weapons, and artillery cutting down organisms by the thousands, but the swarm kept coming. The Red Thirst became both liability and asset during the ground combat. The violence and bloodshed triggered the genetic curse in battle brothers across all the chapters, warriors succumbing to the overwhelming urge for blood and melee combat. In conventional warfare, this loss of control would be catastrophic. Against the Tyranids, warriors consumed by the thirst sometimes proved devastatingly effective, throwing themselves into the alien swarm with complete abandon and carving through organisms with frenzied intensity. The chaplains struggled to maintain discipline, pulling back battle brothers who showed signs of losing control, while simultaneously recognizing that some degree of the thirst's influence actually enhanced combat effectiveness against an enemy that fought through sheer numbers and aggression. The Black Rage struck with unusual frequency during the Bal campaign. The psychic pressure of the hive mind, combined with the extreme stress of the combat and the sheer violence of the fighting, triggered the curse in battle brothers at rates far above normal. The Death Company swelled with warriors from multiple chapters, all falling into the same visions of Sanguinius's final battle. Dante made the decision to deploy the Death Company as shock troops, dropping them directly into the densest concentrations of Tyranid organisms, where their uncontrolled aggression could achieve maximum effect. The fallen warriors fought with supernatural fury, each one believing themselves to be their Primarch making a final stand against the War Master, and their presence created breakthroughs in the Tyranid swarm that allowed other forces to exploit. Bal itself came under assault as the Tyranid fleet pushed past the orbital defenses. The fortress monastery, that ancient structure that had stood for 10,000 years, became the focus of the Xenos' assault. Bioships in orbit bombarded the fortress with bioweapons, attempting to crack its void shields and breach its walls. Spore pods rained down on the surrounding terrain, disgorging organisms that attacked the fortress from all directions simultaneously. Dante pulled back forces from Bal Secundus, recognizing that the fortress monastery's fall would mean the effective end of the Blood Angels as a chapter. The gene seed stocks, the chapter's records and relics, the recruitment facilities and training grounds all existed within or around the fortress. Its loss would be irreplaceable. The siege of the fortress monastery became the campaign's critical phase. The Tyranids threw themselves against the ancient walls in waves that seemed to have no end. The defenders fired until their weapons overheated, reloaded and fired again, killing organisms by the millions, yet still the swarm pressed forward. The fortress's automated defenses, weapon systems that had been installed over millennia of continuous improvement, added their fire to the slaughter. Macro cannons fired shells the size of tanks into the densest concentrations of organisms. Defense lasers swept across the battlefield, burning through chitin and flesh. Missile batteries launched salvos that airburst over the swarm, raining down frag munitions that shredded the smaller organisms. None of it was enough to stop the advance. The situation became desperate as supplies dwindled and casualties mounted. The chapter's apothecaries worked without rest, treating wounded battle brothers and harvesting gene seed from the fallen. The gene seed recovery became critical as losses accumulated. Each fallen Space Marine represented not just a lost warrior, but potentially lost gene seed, the precious genetic material needed to create future battle brothers. The apothecaries risked their lives recovering gene seed from bodies in active combat zones, recognizing that the chapter's future depended on preserving as much of this irreplaceable resource as possible. Dante fought alongside his battle brothers throughout the siege, the golden death mask marking him as a figure of inspiration and a priority target for the Tyrannid swarm. The hive mind recognized command structures and consistently directed forces toward identified leaders. He faced bioforms specifically adapted to kill Space Marine commanders, massive organisms equipped with crushing claws and bioplasma weapons. His ancient power sword, a relic that had served Blood Angel's chapter masters since the heresy, cut through chitin and flesh with equal ease, but even his skill and experience were tested by the sheer relentlessness of the assault. The red thirst pulled at him constantly during the fighting, the unprecedented violence triggering the curse with intensity he had rarely experienced. Only the rigid mental discipline developed over 1,500 years kept him functional as a commander, rather than reduced to a blood-mad berserker. The fortress monastery's outer walls fell after weeks of continuous assault. The Tyrannids breached the defenses through sheer persistence, overwhelming sections of wall through weight of numbers, until the defenders could no longer hold. The fighting moved into the fortress itself, a nightmare of close-quarters combat in corridors and chambers that had been home to the Blood Angels for 10 millennia. Dante ordered a fighting withdrawal to the inner fortress, abandoning the outer sections to preserve his remaining forces. The decision was tactically sound, but emotionally devastating, giving up portions of the fortress monastery to the Xenos swarm. When the situation seemed completely hopeless, when the inner fortress was surrounded and ammunition stocks were nearly exhausted, the sky split with the thunder of mass translation. A fleet emerged from the warp at the system's edge, hundreds of warships bearing the iconography of the Imperium. The Indomitus Crusade had arrived. At its head was Roboute Guilliman, the returned Primarch, leading the largest Imperial military force assembled since the Great Crusade. The fleet included not just Space Marines from dozens of chapters, but also massive contingents of Imperial Guard, Adeptus Mechanicus forces, and the new Primaris Space Marines that Guilliman had brought forth from stasis. The Primarch's intervention turned the tide immediately. The Indomitus Crusade fleet engaged the Tyrannid bioships with overwhelming firepower, clearing orbital space and allowing reinforcements to reach the surface. Guilliman himself led the ground assault, the Lord Commander of the Imperium fighting, alongside the sons of his brother Sanguinius in the defense of their homeworld. The Primarch's tactical genius and the fresh forces he brought broke the Tyrannid assault, pushing the Xenos organisms back from the fortress monastery and beginning the systematic extermination of the swarm that had infested Baal and its moons. The campaign to clear the Baal system of Tyrannid presence took months, but the outcome was no longer in doubt once the Indomitus Crusade committed its full strength. The Blood Angels and their successor chapters, reduced to fractions of their original strength and exhausted by the prolonged siege, fought alongside the Crusade forces in the final cleanup operations. The cost had been catastrophic. Thousands of Space Marines had fallen, entire chapters reduced to handfuls of survivors. The Baal system's population had been largely consumed, the tribal peoples of Baal Secundus either dead or evacuated, the recruitment base that had sustained the Blood Angels for 10,000 years devastated. Guilliman summoned Dante to a meeting aboard the Primarch's flagship after the immediate threat had passed. The chapter master, still wearing his golden death mask and bearing the scars of the campaign, stood before the returned son of the Emperor. Guilliman spoke of the Imperium's current state, of the great rift that had split the galaxy and created the region known as Imperium Nihilus, cut off from the Astronomican's light and isolated from Terra's direct authority. The dark half of the Imperium needed leadership, someone with the experience and capability to coordinate Imperial forces across hundreds of sectors without direct support from Terra. Guilliman appointed Dante as Regent of Imperium Nihilus, granting him authority over all Imperial forces on the dark side of the Great Rift. The appointment recognized Dante's 1,500 years of service, his proven strategic abilities, and his success in coordinating the defense of Baal despite impossible odds. The Primarch acknowledged that Dante had wanted rest, had perhaps earned the right to lay down his burdens after centuries of service, but the Imperium's need was too great. Dante accepted the appointment without hesitation, recognizing that his duty to the Emperor and the Imperium superseded any personal desires. The golden mask that had marked him as chapter master of the Blood Angels would now represent imperial authority across half the galaxy, and the warrior who had begun life as a tribal youth on an irradiated moon would command forces beyond anything he had imagined during his ascension to the Adeptus Astartes. The Axe Mortalis represents one of the most storied weapons in the Blood Angel's armory, a master-crafted power axe that has served Dante since his elevation to chapter master over a millennium ago. The weapon's origins trace back to the chapter's founding, forged in the aftermath of the Horus Heresy, when the Blood Angels were rebuilding their strength and establishing the traditions that would define them across the following 10,000 years. The artificers who created the Axe Mortalis worked with technologies and materials that modern techmarines can maintain, but no longer fully replicate, incorporating power field generators of exceptional quality and molecular bonding techniques that have been partially lost to the Imperium's gradual technological decline. The axe's head measures approximately 40 centimeters from edge to edge, crafted from a folded adamantium alloy that combines extreme hardness with enough flexibility to resist shattering under the tremendous forces generated during combat. The cutting edges maintain a monomolecular sharpness through the action of the power field, which disrupts molecular bonds on contact and allows the weapon to cleave through ceramite armor, reinforced plasteel, and even the toughened carapaces of Xenos organisms with equal efficiency. The power field itself generates a distinctive blue-white corona when activated, accompanied by the characteristic high-pitched whine common to all power weapons, but with a deeper harmonic undertone that experienced warriors recognize as indicating superior craftsmanship. The haft extends roughly 120 centimeters, proportioned for use by a space marine in power armor. The grip section features carefully textured surfaces that provide secure purchase even when gauntlets are covered in blood, oil, or other battlefield contaminants. Internal conduits channel power from the weapon's integral generator to the axe head, with redundant systems ensuring continued operation even if primary power feeds are damaged. The pommel contains a backup power cell that can sustain the weapon's field for approximately 30 minutes of continuous combat if the primary generator fails, a feature that has saved Dante's life on multiple occasions when fighting in conditions that damaged his armor's power supply. Dante's selection of the Axe Mortalis as his primary melee weapon reflects both practical considerations and symbolic meaning. The Blood Angels traditionally favor swords, following Sanguinius's example, and most chapter masters have carried ornate power swords as their primary close combat weapons. Dante's choice of an axe instead marks a deliberate departure from this tradition. The axe offers advantages in certain combat situations, particularly against heavily armored opponents where the weapon's mass and the concentration of force along a smaller edge surface generate greater penetrating power than a sword's cutting action. Against Chaos Space Marines in corrupted power armor, against Orc warbosses protected by layers of crude but effective plating, and against Tyrannid bioforms with reinforced exoskeletons, the Axe Mortalis has proven devastatingly effective. The weapon has accumulated a combat history across Dante's extended service that the chapter's librarians have documented in exhaustive detail. The axe has killed Chaos champions, whose names are recorded in the Blood Angels book of the fallen enemy commanders, whose deaths are commemorated in the chapter's victory rolls. During the Third War for Armageddon, Dante wielded the Axe Mortalis against Orc warbosses, leading massive wayags across the Hive world's industrial zones, the weapon's power field carving through mega armor that conventional weapons could barely scratch. In boarding actions against Chaos vessels, the axe has breached bulkheads and cut through corrupted machinery with equal efficiency, its power field unaffected by the reality warping effects that often plague more sophisticated weapons in the presence of warp contamination. The Axe Mortalis requires constant maintenance to preserve its combat effectiveness. The chapter's Techmarines perform regular inspections, checking the power field generators for fluctuations, examining the adamantium head for microscopic stress fractures, and recalibrating the weapon's machine spirit through the proper rituals and invocations. The axe's machine spirit has grown particularly strong across centuries of use, developing what the Techmarines describe as a fierce and aggressive temperament that resonates with Dante's own combat style. Warriors who have been permitted to examine the weapon report feeling a subtle vibration through the haft even when the power field is inactive, as though the axe itself anticipates violence. The Perdition Pistol serves as Dante's primary ranged weapon, an Inferno pistol of ancient provenance that predates even the Horus Heresy. Inferno pistols represent the smallest class of melta weapons, fusion guns miniaturized to the point where they can be wielded one-handed by a space marine. The technology required to compress a melta weapon's devastating thermal output into such a compact package has always been difficult, and the Perdition Pistol represents craftsmanship from an era when the Imperium's technical capabilities exceeded current standards by significant margins. The weapon generates temperatures sufficient to reduce ceramite, plasteel, and most known materials to molten slag within seconds of exposure, making it devastatingly effective against heavily armored targets at close range. The Perdition Pistol's construction incorporates materials and techniques that modern Adeptus Mechanicus tech priests study, but cannot fully reproduce. The fusion chamber uses a magnetic containment system of exceptional sophistication, maintaining the temperatures and pressures required for the weapon's operation within tolerances measured in fractions of a percent. The thermal dissipation systems prevent the weapon from melting itself during operation, channeling waste heat through carefully designed pathways that radiated away from critical components. The pistol's compact size, barely larger than a standard bolt pistol, belies the complexity of its internal mechanisms and the devastating power it can unleash. Dante has carried the Perdition Pistol throughout his service as Chapter Master, and the weapon has become as closely associated with him as the Golden Death Mask. He wields it with his left hand, while the Axe Mortalis occupies his right, the combination providing him with options for engaging enemies at both range and in melee. The Inferno pistol's relatively short effective range, approximately 15 meters before the thermal beam disperses too much to guarantee penetration of heavy armor, dictates its tactical employment. Dante uses the weapon against priority targets that require immediate elimination, against enemy commanders protected by sophisticated armor, and in situations where a single shot needs to guarantee a kill regardless of the target's defenses. The Perdition Pistol has claimed notable kills throughout Dante's career. During the defense of Asphodex against a Word-Bearer's warband, Dante used the Inferno Pistol to destroy a Chaos Dreadnought that had broken through the Blood Angel's defensive lines, the thermal beam melting through the Ancient Walker's armor and detonating its power plant. Against the Tyranids during the devastation of Baal, the weapon proved invaluable for eliminating Carnifexes and other heavy bioforms that conventional bolter fire struggled to damage effectively. The pistol's machine spirit has bonded with Dante across centuries of use, responding to his intentions with a reliability that Techmarines attribute to the weapon's exceptional craftsmanship and the strength of its machine spirit. Maintenance requirements for the Perdition Pistol exceed those of conventional weapons by orders of magnitude. The fusion chamber requires recalibration after every extended engagement, with Techmarines performing detailed inspections to ensure the magnetic containment systems maintain proper alignment. The thermal dissipation pathways need regular cleaning to remove the microscopic debris that accumulates during firing and can interfere with heat management. The weapon's power cells, which provide the energy required to initiate and maintain fusion reactions, have limited lifespans and must be replaced according to strict schedules regardless of apparent functionality. Despite these demanding maintenance needs, the Perdition Pistol has never failed Dante in combat, a testament to both the weapon's quality and the dedication of the Techmarines who maintain it. Dante's Artificer armor represents the culmination of the Blood Angel's armoring traditions, a masterwork that incorporates technologies and craftsmanship accumulated across 10,000 years of continuous warfare. The armor began as a standard suit of Mark VIII errant pattern power armor, the most recent pattern in widespread production before the introduction of Primaris armor marks. The chapter's master of the forge and his most skilled artificers then spent decades modifying and enhancing this base suit, transforming it into a unique artifact specifically tailored to Dante's needs and status as chapter master. The result is armor that provides protection exceeding standard patterns, while incorporating systems designed to sustain a warrior whose age has pushed far beyond normal Space Marine lifespans. The armor's ceramite plates feature additional layering in critical areas, with composite materials inserted between the primary armor layers to provide enhanced protection against both kinetic and energy weapons. The breastplate incorporates adamantium reinforcement around the areas protecting Dante's primary and secondary hearts, recognizing that damage to these organs would be immediately fatal even to a Space Marine's enhanced physiology. The helmet integrates advanced sensor systems that provide tactical data feeds, threat assessment information, and communication links to command networks, all displayed through the eye lenses in formats that don't interfere with normal vision during combat. The most critical enhancements involve the life support systems that help sustain Dante's ancient body. Standard Space Marine power armor includes basic life support functions, providing atmospheric filtration, temperature regulation, and medical monitoring. Dante's Artificer armor incorporates far more sophisticated systems, including advanced medical servitors built into the armor's structure that continuously monitor his vital signs and can administer stimulants, pain suppressors, or other pharmaceutical interventions automatically when his body shows signs of stress. These systems recognize that Dante's age, while not impairing his combat effectiveness through the combination of his enhanced physiology and sheer experience, places demands on his body that require active management. The armor includes enhanced nutrient recycling systems that extract maximum efficiency from the sustenance Dante consumes, critical for maintaining the energy requirements of a Space Marine's metabolism during extended operations. Waste heat management systems more sophisticated than standard patterns help regulate his body temperature during combat, preventing the thermal stress that can degrade performance during sustained fighting. The armor's power plant, a miniaturized fusion reactor, provides more than sufficient energy for these enhanced systems while maintaining power reserves for the armor's defensive capabilities and weapon systems. The Artificers incorporated numerous small details that reflect Dante's personal combat style and the lessons learned across 15 centuries of warfare. The gauntlets feature reinforced striking surfaces that allow them to be used as weapons in their own right, with power field generators in the knuckles that activate during punching motions to increase impact force. The boots contain magnetic locking systems of exceptional strength, allowing Dante to anchor himself to metallic surfaces during boarding actions or when fighting in zero-gravity environments. The armor's joint seals use materials resistant to the corrosive effects of tyrannid bioacids, a modification made after encounters with the Great Devourer demonstrated that standard seals could be compromised by these substances. The armor's appearance reflects Dante's status and the Blood Angel's aesthetic traditions. The ceramite is painted in the chapter's crimson, with gold trim marking his rank as chapter master. His personal heraldry decorates the shoulder plates, while purity seals and oath papers accumulated over centuries of service hang from various attachment points. The armor bears the scars of countless battles despite regular maintenance and repair, with areas where the ceramite has been patched or replaced showing slight color variations from the original plating. These battle scars are deliberately preserved rather than completely refinished, serving as physical records of the campaigns Dante has survived. The iron halo that Dante wears represents one of the Imperium's most sophisticated personal defense technologies, a conversion field generator that has saved his life on numerous occasions across his extended service. Iron halos are awarded only to Space Marine commanders of exceptional rank and achievement, with each chapter maintaining a limited number of these precious devices. The technology creates a protective energy field around the wearer that converts incoming weapons' fire into blinding flashes of light and electromagnetic interference, dissipating the energy that would otherwise strike the target. The effect provides protection roughly equivalent to void shields used on vehicles and starships, though on a much smaller scale appropriate for personal defense. The iron halo mounted on Dante's armor takes the form of a stylized halo positioned behind his head and shoulders, incorporating the winged blood drop iconography that serves as the Blood Angels chapter symbol. The device masses approximately 8 kilograms, with most of that weight consisting of the power cells and field generators required to produce the protective effect. The halo's visible components are crafted from gold and ceramite, decorated with micro-engraving that depicts scenes from the Blood Angels' history and incorporates protective wards and benedictions in High Gothic. The aesthetic effect reinforces Dante's authority and status, the golden halo creating a visual impression of divine favor that has significant psychological impact on both allies and enemies. The conversion field's operation draws heavily on the armor's power supply, with each activation draining energy reserves that must be replenished by the suit's reactor. The field does not provide continuous protection, but rather activates automatically when sensors detect incoming fire, generating the protective barrier for fractions of a second, with timing calculated to intercept the threat. This pulsed operation conserves power while maintaining effectiveness, though it means the iron halo has practical limits on how many hits it can absorb during extended engagements before power reserves are exhausted, and the device requires time to recharge. Dante has tested the iron halo's protection against virtually every weapon type the Imperium's enemies employ. The conversion field has deflected bolter rounds, plasma bolts, laser fire, and even the more exotic weapons wielded by Xeno's species and Chaos forces. During the defense of Baal, the iron halo saved Dante from bioplasma attacks that would have melted through his armor, the conversion field transforming the superheated matter into harmless light and dissipated heat. Against Chaos forces wielding demon weapons, the field has proven effective even against attacks that carry warp-based effects, though such encounters place greater strain on the device's systems than conventional weapons do. The iron halo requires maintenance as demanding as any of Dante's other equipment. Tech Marines inspect the field generators regularly, checking for the microscopic degradation that occurs with each activation. The power cells need periodic replacement, their capacity gradually declining over time despite the best preservation efforts. The device's machine spirit requires regular ministration through the proper rituals, with tech priests performing the invocations and benedictions that maintain the spirit's cooperation and effectiveness. Any damage to the iron halo receives immediate priority for repair, given its critical role in preserving the chapter master's life during combat operations. Together, these artifacts form the equipment loadout that has become synonymous with Dante's image across the Imperium. The Golden Death Mask, the Axe Mortalis, the Perdition Pistol, the Artificer Armor, and the Iron Halo combine to create a visual impression of authority and martial power that reinforces his position as both Chapter Master of the Blood Angels and Regent of Imperium Nihilus. Each piece represents the finest craftsmanship the Imperium can produce, maintained through constant effort by the chapter's tech marines, and serving as physical symbols of the responsibilities Dante bears. The weapons have drunk the blood of the Imperium's enemies across 1,000 years of warfare, their histories intertwined with Dante's own service record in ways that make them inseparable from his legend. The First Tyrannic War marked humanity's initial encounter with the full horror of the Tyranid threat, when Hive Fleet Behemoth emerged from the intergalactic void and drove toward the eastern fringe with single-minded purpose. The Xenos swarm consumed worlds in its path, stripping them of all biological matter before moving to the next target. By the time Imperial authorities recognized the scale of the threat, dozens of systems had already fallen silent, their populations devoured and their planets reduced to lifeless rocks. The Hive Fleet's trajectory pointed directly toward Ultramar, the realm of the Ultramarines and one of the Imperium's most prosperous and well-defended regions. Marneus Calgar, chapter master of the Ultramarines, issued urgent calls for reinforcement as his forces mobilized to defend their homeworld of Macragge. Dante responded immediately to the Ultramarines' request for aid, recognizing that the Tyranid threat represented something unprecedented in the Imperium's long history of warfare. The Blood Angels had encountered smaller Tyrannid organisms before, gene-stealers and their cultist broods infesting space hulks and isolated worlds, but nothing approaching the scale of a full Hive fleet. He dispatched 3 companies of Blood Angels to Ultramar, leading the relief force personally despite the demands of his broader responsibilities as chapter master. The journey through the warp took weeks, with the navigators reporting unusual turbulence that suggested the Hive fleet's massive psychic presence was affecting even the Imperium's currents. The Blood Angels arrived at Crag to find the Ultramarines already engaged in desperate fighting across multiple fronts. The Tyrannids had established beachheads on several of Ultramar's worlds, their spore ships seeding the planets with organisms that immediately began consuming local biomass and reproducing at exponential rates. Crag itself faced direct assault, with bioships entering orbit and launching mycetic spores toward the planet's surface in numbers that overwhelmed defensive fire. The Ultramarines' first company, their elite Terminator veterans, held the polar fortresses against waves of Tyrannid warriors and larger bioforms, while other companies fought to prevent the Xenos from reaching the planet's population centers. Dante coordinated his forces with Calgar's command structure, the 2 chapter masters establishing a unified defense that leveraged the strengths of both chapters. The Ultramarines' tactical doctrine emphasized disciplined firepower and defensive positions, creating kill zones where the Tyrannids' numerical advantage could be neutralized through concentrated fire. The Blood Angels brought their traditional aggressive assault tactics, using jump pack-equipped assault squads to strike at synapse creatures and disrupt the Hive mind's control over lesser organisms. The combination proved effective, with Ultramarine fire support allowing Blood Angels' assault elements to penetrate deep into Tyrannid formations without being overwhelmed by counterattacks. The battle for the polar fortresses tested both chapters to their limits. The Tyrannids attacked in waves that never ceased, their organisms driven by the Hive mind's implacable will to consume all biomass. Hormagaunts and Termagants formed the initial assault waves, dying in thousands as bolter fire and heavy weapons cut them down, but their deaths served to identify defensive positions and expend ammunition. Behind them came larger organisms, warriors and carnifexes that could absorb tremendous damage while closing to melee range. The synapse creatures coordinating these assaults remained behind the front lines, protected by layers of lesser organisms, while their psychic presence maintained cohesion across the swarm. Dante led several counterattacks aimed at eliminating these synapse creatures, recognizing that disrupting the Hive mind's control structure would cause temporary confusion among the lesser organisms. His assault squads, equipped with jump packs and close combat weapons, launched from the fortress walls and descended on identified synapse nodes with devastating effect. The Axe Mortales proved particularly effective against Tyrannid warriors, the power axes field cutting through their reinforced carapaces with single strikes. The Perdition Pistol eliminated carnifexes and other heavy bioforms that conventional weapons struggled to damage, the Inferno Pistol's thermal beam melting through their armored hides. These surgical strikes created windows of opportunity that the Ultramarines exploited with precision fire, eliminating disorganized Tyrannid organisms before the Hive mind could re-establish control. The tactic worked repeatedly across the early phases of the battle, but the Hive mind adapted quickly. Subsequent assaults saw synapse creatures positioned more defensively, with additional organisms dedicated to protecting them from aerial assault. The Tyrannids began deploying gargoyles and other flying organisms, specifically to intercept Blood Angels' jump troops, forcing Dante to adjust his approach and accept higher casualties during these critical strikes. The space battle above Crag raged simultaneously with the ground fighting, the combined fleets of the Ultramarines and Blood Angels engaging the Tyrannid bioships in a struggle for orbital control. The Hive Fleet's numbers were staggering, bioships by the hundreds forming a living blockade around Crag that threatened to cut off reinforcement and resupply. The Imperial fleet focused on destroying the larger Hive ships, recognizing that these massive organisms served as coordination nodes for the fleet and carried the genetic templates needed to spawn new bioforms. Each Hive ship destroyed represented a significant blow to the Tyranid fleet's overall capability, but the cost in Imperial vessels was severe. Dante participated in several boarding actions against damaged bioships, leading Blood Angels assault teams into the alien vessels' organic interiors to plant melta charges and destroy them from within. The environment inside Tyranid bioships defied normal comprehension. All surfaces formed from living tissue that pulsed with alien life, the air thick with spores, and the temperature fluctuating wildly between freezing and scorching. The organisms defending these ships fought with particular ferocity, as though recognizing the threat to their vessel. Dante's forces carved through corridors of living flesh, the Ax Mortalis hacking through bulkheads that bled when cut, until they reached the bio-ship's vital organs and placed the charges that would destroy them. The turning point came when Kage led a desperate assault on the Hive Fleet's primary Hive ship, a massive organism that served as the central coordination node for the entire Tyranid force. The Ultramarines chapter master teleported directly into the Hive ship with his first company, fighting through its interior to reach and destroy the creature's brain. The operation succeeded, but at tremendous cost. Kage himself was gravely wounded, his body so badly damaged that only immediate intervention by the Ultramarines apothecaries and subsequent entombment in a life support system saved his life. The Hive ship's destruction threw the Tyranid fleet into disarray, breaking the coordination that had made it so effective. Dante assumed overall command of the Imperial forces during Kage's recovery period, coordinating the final phases of the battle that saw the Tyranid presence systematically eliminated from Ultramar. The fighting continued for months after the Hive ship's destruction, with isolated Tyranid organisms and smaller synapse clusters requiring hunting down and extermination. The Blood Angels remained at Macragge throughout this cleanup phase, their experience and Dante's leadership proving invaluable as Imperial forces adapted to fighting an enemy unlike any they had faced before. The First Tyrannic War established many of the tactical doctrines that would guide Imperial responses to subsequent Tyranid incursions, with lessons learned at Macragge being disseminated across the Imperium's military forces. The Cryptus campaign, occurring several millennia after the First Tyrannic War, demonstrated that the Tyranid threat had not diminished with time. Hive Fleet Leviathan, larger than Behemoth had been, sent vanguard forces toward the Cryptus system in the Ultima Segmentum. The system contained the Shield of Baal, a cluster of worlds that served as defensive positions, protecting the approaches to the Baal system itself. Dante recognized immediately that this Tyranid advance threatened the Blood Angels' homeworld directly, and he mobilized the chapter's full strength to meet the threat before it could reach Baal. The Cryptus system's worlds became battlegrounds, where the Blood Angels fought to delay and attrit the Tyranid vanguard. Asphodex, Phodia, and the other planets in the cluster saw intense fighting as the Blood Angels established defensive positions and forced the Tyranids to pay heavily for every world they consumed. Dante's strategy focused on maximizing Tyranid casualties while preserving his own forces, recognizing that a war of attrition against the Great Devourer was ultimately unwinnable, but that inflicting sufficient losses might convince the Hive mind to divert its forces toward easier targets. The Blood Angels fought with calculated aggression, launching strikes against synapse creatures and bioship landing zones, while avoiding being drawn into prolonged engagements where Tyranid numbers would inevitably prevail. The campaign saw Dante employing every tactic he had learned during the First Tyrannic War and subsequent encounters with the Tyranids. He coordinated with the Adeptus Mechanicus forces present in the system, using their expertise with technology to establish sensor networks that provided early warning of Tyranid movements. The Imperial Navy maintained orbital superiority through aggressive fleet actions, preventing the Tyranids from establishing complete control over any single world. The Blood Angels assault companies conducted raids deep into Tyranid-held territory, destroying digestion pools, where the Xenos converted consumed biomass into new organisms, and targeting the capillary towers that the Tyranids used to transmit resources to their bioships in orbit. Dante's expertise in anti-Tyranid warfare became increasingly recognized across the Imperium during the Cryptus campaign. Other Imperial commanders sought his counsel on fighting the Great Devourer, and the tactical doctrines he developed were incorporated into official Imperial Guard training materials. His understanding of Tyranid behavior patterns, the way the hive mind adapted to different threats, and the predictable responses certain actions would trigger, allowed him to anticipate enemy movements and position his forces advantageously. The campaign ultimately succeeded in its primary objective of preventing the Tyranid vanguard from reaching Bal directly, though the cost in Blood Angels' lives was significant. The forces of chaos represented a different category of threat, enemies that fought not for survival or resources, but out of hatred and the desire to corrupt. The Black Legion, inheritors of the War Master's forces and led by Abaddon the Despoiler, had clashed with the Blood Angels numerous times across the millennia. These engagements carried particular weight because the Black Legion had once been the Luna Wolves and then the Sons of Horus, the Primarch who had killed Sanguinius. Every Blood Angel felt a visceral hatred for Horus's legacy, and battles against the Black Legion triggered the Red Thirst with unusual intensity. Dante led Blood Angels' forces against Black Legion warbands during multiple Black Crusades, the massive chaos invasions that periodically erupted from the Eye of Terror. During the 13th Black Crusade, the largest and most successful of Abaddon's attempts to break out of the Eye, Dante commanded Blood Angels' contingents defending worlds along the Cadian Gate. The fighting was brutal and personal in ways that battles against Xenos never achieved. Chaos Space Marines were former loyalists, warriors who had betrayed everything the Imperium stood for, and their presence on the battlefield generated fury among the Blood Angels that went beyond normal combat aggression. The Word Bearers, the 17th Legion that had orchestrated the Horus heresy itself, earned particular enmity from the Blood Angels. These Chaos Space Marines worshipped the ruinous powers directly, spreading corruption wherever they went and attempting to turn loyal Imperial citizens to chaos. Dante had fought Word-Bearers' warbands across dozens of campaigns, from boarding actions against their corrupted vessels to planetary sieges where the traitors attempted to establish demon worlds. The Word-Bearers' use of sorcery and demon summoning required different tactical approaches than conventional enemies, with the Blood Angels librarians playing critical roles in countering the psychic threats the Chaos forces deployed. One notable engagement against the Word-Bearers occurred on the Shrine World of Sabatine, where a warband led by a Dark Apostle attempted to corrupt the planet's population through a series of ritual massacres. Dante led the Blood Angels' response, arriving before the corruption could spread beyond containment. The battle for Sabatine's primary cathedral became legendary within the chapter, with Dante personally confronting the Dark Apostle in single combat while his forces fought to prevent demon manifestation. The Axe Mortalis proved effective against the Chaos Champion's corrupted armor, the power axe's field cutting through the warp-tainted ceramite despite the protective wards the Word-Bearer had inscribed on his armor. The Dark Apostle's death disrupted the ritual, preventing the demon incursion and saving Sabatine from corruption. Orc-Waz represented a more straightforward threat, massive greenskin invasions, driven by the orcs' love of violence and their need to fight. Dante had fought orcs across his entire career, from small raiding parties to massive Waz that threatened entire sectors. The orcs' resilience and crude effectiveness made them dangerous opponents despite their lack of sophistication. Their technology, cobbled together from scrap and operating through principles that defied logic, somehow worked through the psychic field the greenskins generated collectively. Their numbers could be staggering, with a successful Wa attracting orcs from across nearby systems until millions of the creatures descended on target worlds. The Third War for Armageddon saw Dante leading Blood Angels' forces in support of the overall Imperial defense. The Hive world faced invasion by Ghazghkull Thraka, one of the largest and most dangerous orc warlords in the galaxy. The fighting across Armageddon's industrial zones tested every aspect of the Blood Angels' capabilities, from urban warfare in the Hive cities to armored engagements across the ash wastes. Dante's forces specialized in hunting orc warbosses, recognizing that eliminating the leaders who held Waz together often caused the greenskin forces to fragment into smaller, more manageable groups. The Axe Mortalis claimed several warboss kills during the Armageddon campaign, the power axe proving particularly effective against the massive orcs who led their kind into battle. Necron Tomb Worlds presented yet another challenge, ancient Xenos machines awakening from millions of years of hibernation, with technologies that made even the Imperium's most sophisticated weapons seem primitive. Dante's encounters with the Necrons taught him that conventional tactics often proved ineffective against enemies who could repair catastrophic damage within moments, and whose weapons could strip targets to atoms. The Blood Angels developed specialized approaches for fighting Necrons, focusing on overwhelming individual units before they could benefit from their reanimation protocols, and targeting the command units whose destruction would cause cascading failures in Necron battle formations. A campaign against a Necron tomb world in the Ghoul Stars sector demonstrated Dante's adaptability when facing technologically superior enemies. The Necrons had awakened and begun harvesting nearby Imperial worlds, their forces advancing with the inexorable patience of machines that had already outlived multiple galactic civilizations. Dante recognized that direct assault against the tomb complex would be suicidal, given the Necrons' defensive capabilities. Instead, he coordinated with Adeptus Mechanicus forces to identify the tomb's power generation systems, then led strike teams in attacks against these critical nodes. The approach succeeded in forcing the Necrons into a premature hibernation cycle, buying the Imperium time to evacuate threatened populations and establish stronger defensive positions. These campaigns across multiple segmentums demonstrated Dante's versatility as a commander and his ability to adapt Blood Angel's doctrine to vastly different enemy types. Each species required different approaches, different tactical considerations, and different strategic thinking. The Tyranids fought through overwhelming numbers and biological adaptation. Chaos forces wielded corruption and demonic powers alongside conventional military strength. Orcs brought crude effectiveness and terrifying numbers. Necrons deployed technologies that seemed to violate natural law. Dante's success against all these threats stemmed from his willingness to analyze each enemy objectively, identify their weaknesses, and develop approaches that leveraged Blood Angel's strengths while mitigating enemy advantages. The position of Chapter Master carries responsibilities that extend far beyond commanding a single chapter of Space Marines. For Dante, these responsibilities multiplied across his extended tenure, particularly in his relationship with the Blood Angel's successor chapters. The Second Founding had created 9 successor chapters from the original Blood Angels Legion, each inheriting portions of Sanguinius's gene seed and carrying forward aspects of the parent chapter's traditions. Subsequent foundings had added more chapters to this bloodline, creating a network of related chapters that looked to the Blood Angels as their progenitors, and to Dante as the senior leader of their shared genetic heritage. The relationship between Dante and the other chapter masters required careful balance. Each successor chapter maintained complete autonomy, commanded by its own chapter master, who answered to no authority except the Emperor and the High Lords of Terra. They were not subordinate to the Blood Angels, and any suggestion otherwise would have been both politically unacceptable and contrary to the Codex Astartes principles that governed Space Marine organization. Yet the shared gene seed created bonds that transcended formal command structures. The successor chapters faced the same genetic curses as their parent chapter, struggled with the same red thirst and black rage that haunted all of Sanguinius's sons. This common burden created a sense of shared identity that made the successor chapters more willing to coordinate with the Blood Angels than they might with unrelated chapters. Dante cultivated these relationships through regular communication and mutual support that respected the successor chapters' independence while acknowledging their shared heritage. He established protocols for sharing intelligence about threats that might affect multiple chapters, coordinated responses to major crises that required forces beyond what a single chapter could muster, and facilitated the exchange of information about managing the gene curse. The sanguinary priests of different chapters met periodically to discuss their research into the Red Thirst and Black Rage, sharing findings and experimental approaches under agreements that Dante helped negotiate. These meetings produced no breakthrough cures, but they ensured that all of Sanguinius's bloodline benefited from whatever incremental progress any individual chapter achieved. The Flesh Terrors presented particular challenges in this network of relationships. Their chapter master, Gabriel Seth, led warriors whose gene seed manifested the Red Thirst with exceptional severity. The Flesh Terrors had a reputation for savagery that troubled even other Blood Angels' successors, with their battles often ending in massacres that went beyond military necessity. Seth himself was a pragmatic and capable commander, but he struggled constantly with his chapter's genetic instability and the knowledge that the Flesh Terrors might be doomed to extinction as the Red Thirst consumed them. Dante maintained contact with Seth despite the difficulties, recognizing that isolating the Flesh Terrors would only accelerate their decline. He provided what support he could, including access to Blood Angels' sanguinary priests for consultation and offers to accept Flesh Terrors who sought transfer to stabilize their numbers. The relationship between Dante and Seth carried undertones of tension that both chapter masters navigated carefully. Seth resented what he perceived as condescension from other chapters who viewed the Flesh Terrors as unstable berserkers. Dante worked to avoid triggering this resentment while still offering genuine assistance. During the devastation of Baal, Seth brought his entire chapter to the defense of the Blood Angels' homeworld, and the Flesh Terrors' ferocity proved invaluable during the desperate fighting. The campaign created a bond of shared sacrifice between the two chapter masters, with Dante publicly acknowledging the Flesh Terrors' contribution and Seth recognizing that the Blood Angels faced the same fundamental struggles as his own chapter, merely manifesting differently. The Angels in Carmine maintained closer ties to the Blood Angels, their traditions and organization closely mirroring the parent chapter's structure. Their chapter master consulted with Dante regularly on strategic matters, and the two chapters had fought together in numerous campaigns across the centuries. The Angels in Carmine's gene seed appeared slightly more stable than some other successors, with lower rates of the Black Rage, though whether this represented genuine genetic variation or simply statistical fluctuation remained unclear. Dante valued the Angels in Carmine's reliability and their willingness to coordinate operations, making them frequent allies when situations required forces beyond a single chapter's strength. The Blood Drinkers had developed unique rituals for managing the Red Thirst, practices that involved controlled blood consumption in ceremonial contexts. These rituals troubled some imperial authorities, who saw them as dangerously close to the practices of chaos cults, but the Blood Drinkers maintained that their traditions helped them control the thirst rather than succumb to it. Dante defended the Blood Drinkers against criticism from outside the bloodline, recognizing that each chapter needed to find its own methods for managing the gene curse. He drew the line at practices that actually involved corruption or violated the Codex Astartes' fundamental principles, but ritualized blood drinking, while disturbing to outsiders, did not cross that threshold if it helped the Blood Drinkers maintain discipline and combat effectiveness. Beyond the successor chapters, Dante's relationships with other chapter masters across the Imperium reflected both the respect his service had earned and the political complexities of space marine politics. Marnius Calgar of the Ultramarines represented one of Dante's most significant relationships with a chapter master outside the Blood Angels' bloodline. The two had fought together during the First Tyrannic War, with Dante assuming command of the defense of Macragge during Calgar's recovery from his near-fatal wounds. That shared experience created mutual respect that endured across the subsequent centuries. Calgar and Dante approached warfare differently, with the Ultramarines chapter master emphasizing adherence to the Codex Astartes, while Dante demonstrated more flexibility in tactical doctrine, but both recognized the other's capabilities and achievements. The relationship between the Blood Angels and Ultramarines carried historical weight beyond the personal connection between their chapter masters. The Ultramarines served as the exemplar chapter, their practices and organization held up as the standard all others should follow. The Blood Angels, while respected, deviated from Codex doctrine in various ways, particularly in their organization of the Death Company and their emphasis on assault tactics over the balanced approach the Codex advocated. Dante navigated these differences by demonstrating that the Blood Angels' variations from Codex standards served necessary purposes given their unique circumstances. The Death Company existed because the Black Rage demanded specialized handling. The emphasis on assault tactics leveraged the Blood Angels' genetic advantages in speed and close combat capability. Kage, pragmatic despite his chapter's reputation for Codex adherence, accepted these explanations and maintained productive working relationships with the Blood Angels. Azrael of the Dark Angels presented a more complicated relationship. The Dark Angels and their successors maintained secrets that they guarded with obsessive intensity, particularly regarding the fallen angels who had betrayed the Emperor during the Horus Heresy. Azrael's primary loyalty was to hunting these traitors, and he would abandon other commitments if intelligence about the fallen emerged. Dante found this single-minded focus troubling, particularly when it interfered with broader imperial strategic needs, but he recognized that every chapter had its burdens and obsessions. The Dark Angel's gene seed carried no obvious physical flaws like the Blood Angel's curses, but their psychological damage from the Fallen's betrayal ran equally deep. Interactions between Dante and Azrael were professionally cordial, but lacked the warmth of Dante's relationship with Kage. The Dark Angel's secretiveness prevented the kind of open communication that would have built stronger bonds. Dante suspected that Azrael and his inner circle knew things about the Horus Heresy and the Imperium's history that they refused to share even with other loyal Space Marines. This secrecy frustrated Dante, who believed that cooperation between chapters required trust and transparency. However, he maintained working relationships with the Dark Angels, recognizing that their combat effectiveness and loyalty to the Emperor, despite their obsessions, made them valuable allies when they could be convinced to commit forces to shared objectives. Logan Grimnar of the Space Wolves represented yet another distinct relationship. The Space Wolves rejected the Codex Astartes almost entirely, maintaining their unique organization and traditions that dated back to their Primarch Leman Russ. Grimnar was older than most chapter masters, though still centuries younger than Dante, and he led his chapter with a combination of ferocity and cunning that earned respect even from those who disapproved of the Space Wolves' departures from standard doctrine. Dante and Grimnar had fought together during several campaigns, and the two chapter masters developed mutual respect despite their very different approaches to warfare and chapter leadership. The Space Wolves' reputation for defying authority, including their conflicts with the Inquisition, sometimes complicated Dante's interactions with Grimnar. The Blood Angels maintained more diplomatic relationships with imperial institutions, recognizing that cooperation with the Inquisition and other organizations served the chapter's long-term interests, even when individual inquisitors proved difficult. Grimnar's willingness to openly oppose inquisitorial authority when he believed it conflicted with the Emperor's true interests represented a bolder approach than Dante typically employed. Yet Dante recognized that the Space Wolves' defiance sometimes achieved results that more diplomatic approaches could not, and he privately admired Grimnar's courage in standing against authorities who wielded tremendous power. The Sanguinor remained one of the most mysterious elements in Dante's experience as chapter master. This golden armored figure appeared during the Blood Angels' most desperate battles, fighting with supernatural skill and seeming to embody Sanguinius's noble spirit. The Sanguinor spoke rarely if ever, communicating through gestures and its presence rather than words. Its appearances could not be predicted or requested. The entity simply manifested when the Blood Angels faced their darkest moments, turned the tide of battle through its intervention, then disappeared as mysteriously as it had arrived. Dante had witnessed the Sanguinor's intervention on multiple occasions across his extended service. During the defense of Baal against Hive Fleet Leviathan, the golden figure appeared when the fortress monastery's fall seemed inevitable, its presence inspiring the defenders to renewed efforts and its combat prowess eliminating Tyrannid synapse creatures that were coordinating the assault. The Sanguinor's blade, a golden sword that seemed to burn with inner light, cut through chitin and flesh with devastating efficiency. Its mere presence affected the Red Thirst, somehow helping battle brothers maintain control even in the midst of the most intense violence. Warriors who fought alongside the Sanguinor reported feeling a sense of calm determination, as though their Primarch himself watched over them. The nature of the Sanguinor remained subject to debate among the Blood Angels' leadership. The chaplains believed it represented a manifestation of Sanguinius's spirit, the great angel's essence somehow preserved and able to manifest in the material universe when his sons faced their greatest trials. The librarians theorized it might be a psychic construct, created unconsciously by the collective faith of the Blood Angels and given form through warp energies. The sanguinary priests wondered if it might be a heavily modified space marine, perhaps one who had been transformed through some ancient process into a living embodiment of the chapter's ideals. Dante held no definitive opinion on the Sanguinor's true nature. What mattered was that it appeared when needed most, and its intervention had saved the Blood Angels from destruction on multiple occasions. The relationship between Dante and the Sanguinor, if relationship was even the correct term, existed more as a one-sided awareness than any form of dialogue or consultation. The Sanguinor appeared, fought alongside the Blood Angels, then departed without explanation or discussion. Dante could not summon it, could not communicate with it in any meaningful way, and received no counsel or guidance from its presence beyond the implicit message that the Blood Angels remained worthy of their Primarch's protection. Yet the Sanguinor's recurring appearances across Dante's service created a strange sense of connection, as though the entity recognized him specifically and chose to manifest during battles where his leadership proved critical to the chapter's survival. Within the Blood Angels chapter itself, Dante's relationships with key commanders formed the foundation of his ability to lead effectively. Captain Carline of the First Company represented one of Dante's most trusted subordinates, a veteran warrior who commanded the chapter's Terminator armored elite. Carline had served in the First Company for centuries, accumulating experience and skill that made him one of the chapter's most formidable warriors. His tactical judgment and ability to lead the First Company in the most demanding operations earned Dante's complete confidence. During the devastation of Baal, Carline commanded critical defensive positions and led counterattacks that prevented Tyranid breakthroughs at several crucial moments. The relationship between Dante and Carline was built on mutual respect and shared experience. Carline understood Dante's strategic thinking and could translate the chapter master's intentions into effective tactical execution without requiring detailed instructions. This allowed Dante to focus on broader command responsibilities, while trusting that Carline would handle First Company operations with the skill and judgment the situations demanded. Carline, for his part, valued Dante's leadership and recognized that the chapter master's extended experience provided insights that even veteran captains could not match. The two worked together with an efficiency that came from centuries of shared service and complete trust in each other's capabilities. Chief Librarian Mephiston represented a more complex relationship. Mephiston had once been Brother Callisterius, a librarian who fell to the Black Rage during a battle against Chaos forces. By all expectations, he should have been inducted into the Death Company and sent to his final battle. Instead, through circumstances that remained unclear even to Mephiston himself, he had somehow overcome the Black Rage, emerging from the experience transformed and vastly more powerful. He became Mephiston, the Lord of Death, a psyker of exceptional strength whose abilities exceeded those of typical Space Marine librarians by significant margins. Dante recognized Mephiston's value to the chapter while remaining aware of the potential dangers the chief librarian represented. Mephiston's survival of the Black Rage was unprecedented, suggesting either a fundamental change in the Gene Curse's nature or something unique about Mephiston himself. His increased psychic power made him invaluable in combat, capable of countering enemy psykers and demons that would overwhelm conventional forces. Yet that same power carried risks. The line between sanctioned psyker and corrupted witch was always thin, and Mephiston's transformation raised questions about whether he remained entirely uncorrupted. Dante monitored Mephiston carefully while utilizing his abilities, maintaining the balance between leveraging a powerful asset and guarding against potential threats. Chaplain Lemarts of the Death Company occupied a unique position within the chapter's structure. Lemarts had fallen to the Black Rage, but unlike other afflicted warriors, he retained enough lucidity to function as a leader for the Death Company. This partial resistance to the Rage's full effects was as unprecedented as Mephiston's recovery, suggesting that the gene curse affected individuals in ways not fully understood. Lemarts led the Death Company in battle, channeling their fury toward the Emperor's enemies while maintaining enough tactical awareness to coordinate with the chapter's broader operations. Dante's relationship with Lemarts was necessarily limited by the chaplain's condition. Lemarts existed in a state between sanity and madness, lucid enough to communicate and plan, but always on the edge of losing himself completely to the visions of Sanguinius's final battle. Dante valued Lemarts' service and recognized the sacrifice the chaplain made by continuing to function despite his affliction, but he could not rely on Lemarts the way he relied on Carline or even Mephiston. The Death Company required leadership, and Lemarts provided it, but Dante knew that any battle might be the one where Lemarts finally succumbed completely to the Black Rage. These relationships, from the successor chapter masters to the commanders within his own chapter, formed the network through which Dante exercised leadership across the Blood Angels and their successor bloodline. Each relationship required different approaches, different considerations of rank and autonomy, different balances of authority and cooperation. Dante had learned across 15 centuries of service that effective leadership meant understanding these distinctions and adapting his interactions accordingly. The bonds he formed with other chapter masters, the trust he built with his subordinate commanders, and even his mysterious connection to the Sanguinor all contributed to his ability to lead not just a single chapter, but to serve as the de facto leader of all Sanguinius's sons, and eventually as Regent of Imperium Nihilus, commanding forces across half the galaxy. The human body, even when enhanced to the superhuman standards of the Adeptus Astartes, was never designed to function for 1,500 years. Space Marine physiology extended lifespans far beyond normal human limits through the 19 implanted organs that restructured metabolism, reinforced skeletal structure, and provided redundant systems for critical functions. The secondary heart ensured continued operation if the primary failed. The preomner digested food to extract maximum nutrition. The osmodula strengthened bones with ceramic-based compounds. These enhancements, combined with the regular rejuvenat treatments available to chapter masters and the sophisticated medical care the Blood Angels provided their warriors, allowed Space Marines to remain combat effective for centuries beyond what unenhanced humans could achieve. Dante had exceeded even these extended parameters by significant margins. Most Space Marines who survived the constant warfare that defined their existence might serve for 3 to 5 centuries before age-related decline or accumulated injuries forced them into advisory roles or claimed their lives entirely. Chapter masters, protected by the best equipment and receiving priority medical care, sometimes reached 7 or 8 centuries of service. Dante had doubled that exceptional lifespan and continued functioning as both a combatant and commander. The cost of this unprecedented longevity manifested in ways both visible and hidden, physical deterioration that even Space Marine physiology and the best medical intervention could only slow rather than prevent. His face beneath the golden death mask bore the marks of extreme age. The skin had become thin and papery despite the enhanced durability Space Marine physiology normally provided, stretched tight over the reinforced bone structure that remained as solid as ever. Deep lines creased his features, particularly around the eyes and mouth, carved by centuries of expression and the constant tension of command. His eyes themselves had changed, the irises fading from their original color toward a pale gray that suggested the cellular degradation even enhanced organs could not fully resist. The sclera showed the faint yellowing that indicated stress on the Becher's gland and other organs responsible for maintaining bodily chemistry. When he removed the mask in private, which he did rarely, The reflection showed him a face that belonged to something ancient rather than the eternally youthful appearance Space Marines typically maintained. His hair had gone completely white centuries earlier, the pigmentation lost as follicles aged beyond even enhanced biology's ability to maintain. The texture had changed as well, becoming brittle and thin where it had once been thick and resilient. He kept it cropped short in the practical style common among the Blood Angels, but even this simple maintenance revealed how his body struggled with basic cellular regeneration. Small wounds that should have healed within hours now took days to close completely. Bruises that a Space Marine's enhanced metabolism should have processed within minutes lingered for hours, the discoloration fading slowly as overtaxed systems worked to repair damage that younger warriors would have shrugged off without conscious thought. The augmetics had become increasingly necessary as organic systems failed or degraded beyond acceptable performance thresholds. His left eye had been replaced 3 centuries earlier, when the original organ's enhanced vision capabilities began deteriorating, the bionic replacement providing superior visual acuity, but lacking the subtle integration with his nervous system that the organic eye had achieved. The augmetic felt foreign in ways the original never had, a constant reminder of his body's decline. His right hand contained numerous micro-augmetics supporting the joints and tendons, installed gradually over decades as the original structures weakened under the accumulated stress of wielding the Ax Mortalis in thousands of battles. The augmetics allowed him to maintain his grip strength and weapon control, but they required regular maintenance and adjustment that organic tissue would have managed automatically. More extensive augmetics supported his cardiovascular system. Both hearts, primary and secondary, had been reinforced with synthetic components that regulated their rhythm and supplemented their pumping capacity. The enhancements were necessary because even Space Marine hearts eventually accumulated damage from centuries of operating at enhanced performance levels. Combat stress, the physiological demands of power armor operation, and simple accumulated wear had degraded the muscle tissue and valve structures beyond what the Laraman cells and other healing factors could fully repair. The augmetics prevented heart failure, but they introduced their own complications. The synthetic components required power from his armor systems, creating a dependency that troubled him during the rare moments he considered it directly. His skeletal structure, reinforced by the os medulla during his transformation into a Space Marine, had developed stress fractures in several locations despite its ceramic enhancement. The bones had been broken and repaired so many times across 15 centuries of combat that the accumulated damage exceeded even enhanced healing's capacity to restore them to original strength. The apothecaries had installed support frameworks in his legs and spine, internal bracing that prevented catastrophic failure, but added foreign material to what should have been purely organic structure. He felt these additions during movement, subtle sensations of wrongness that his nervous system registered as not quite pain, but definitely discomfort. The life support systems built into his artificer armor had evolved from convenience to necessity. The armor's enhanced medical monitoring no longer simply tracked his vital signs, but actively managed them, administering stimulants to maintain alertness during extended operations, injecting pain suppressors to allow him to function through injuries that would incapacitate younger warriors, and providing supplemental oxygen when his enhanced lungs struggled with the demands of combat exertion. The armor's nutrient recycling systems worked constantly to extract maximum efficiency from his food intake, compensating for digestive organs that no longer processed sustenance with the efficiency they had possessed in his earlier centuries. Without the armor's support, Dante suspected he would struggle to function at the level required of a chapter master, perhaps even at the level expected of a standard battle brother. The psychological weight of his extended existence pressed on him with force equal to the physical deterioration. 1,500 years of continuous warfare, of constant command responsibility, of watching brothers fall while he endured, had accumulated into a burden that no amount of mental conditioning could fully offset. The hypno-indoctrination that created Space Marines included psychological frameworks designed to handle the stress of their violent existence, but those frameworks assumed lifespans measured in centuries rather than millennia. Dante had exceeded the psychological architecture's design parameters as thoroughly as he had exceeded the physical ones. The isolation of command had intensified across the centuries. Chapter masters stood apart from their battle brothers by necessity, maintaining the distance required for effective leadership and the difficult decisions that command demanded. Dante had held this position for over 1,000 years, longer than most chapters had existed. The warriors he commanded had been born, transformed into space marines, served their entire careers, and died while he continued. He had seen generations of blood angels pass through the chapter, each cohort bringing new faces and personalities that he came to know before they fell in battle or succumbed to the gene curse. The cumulative loss created a weight of grief that he carried constantly, thousands of names and faces remembered with the perfect recall his enhanced memory provided. The red thirst had grown stronger as the centuries accumulated. The genetic flaw that pulled all blood angels toward blood-mad violence had intensified its hold on him, requiring ever more active effort to suppress during combat. In his earlier centuries as chapter master, managing the thirst had been challenging, but achievable through the techniques he had developed and the mental discipline his training provided. Now, particularly during intense combat when blood flowed freely and violence reached its peak, he sometimes felt himself teetering on the edge of losing control entirely. The urge to simply let go, to surrender to the thirst and lose himself in mindless slaughter, carried a seductive quality that terrified him in his rare moments of complete honesty with himself. The knowledge that he might fall to the black rage haunted him more with each passing year. The curse struck without warning, transforming battle brothers into warriors trapped in visions of Sanguinius's final battle, regardless of their previous stability or strength of will. Age appeared to be a contributing factor, though the correlation was not absolute. Older battle brothers showed slightly elevated susceptibility, and Dante's unprecedented age placed him in entirely uncharted territory regarding the curse's long-term progression. The sanguinary high priest monitored him more closely than any other warrior in the chapter, conducting regular genetic assessments and psychological evaluations designed to identify early warning signs. Dante submitted to these examinations without resistance, recognizing their necessity, but the knowledge that even the most sophisticated monitoring might provide no advance warning of the rage's onset created constant background anxiety. His dreams had changed across the centuries, becoming increasingly dominated by visions of Sanguinius. The Primarch appeared to him during sleep with growing frequency, sometimes in memories of the great angel's known appearances and teachings, other times in scenarios that Dante's mind constructed from the chapter's lore and his own imagination. These dreams carried an intensity that suggested something beyond normal subconscious processing. The librarians theorized that the gene seed created a weak psychic connection between the blood angels and their Primarch's lingering presence in the warp, a link that might strengthen as warriors aged and accumulated exposure to the genetic material's influence. The most significant recurring vision showed Sanguinius standing before the Golden Throne, the Emperor's shattered body visible on the life support mechanisms that had sustained him for 10,000 years. The Primarch turned to Dante in these dreams, his perfect features bearing an expression of profound sorrow mixed with something that might have been pride or perhaps pity. Sanguinius spoke in these visions, though Dante could never recall the exact words upon waking. The message's emotional content remained clear even when the specific language faded from memory. The Primarch told him that his service was not yet complete, that a final duty awaited him, that he would stand in defense of the Emperor himself when the moment came. This prophetic vision had recurred with increasing frequency across the last several centuries of Dante's service. He had consulted the chapter's librarians about its meaning, seeking their interpretation of whether the dreams represented genuine prophecy or simply his own subconscious processing his desire for an honorable end to his extended service. The chief librarian had been unable to provide definitive answers. Prophetic visions were notoriously difficult to interpret, often becoming clear only in hindsight when the predicted events had already occurred. The imagery of standing before the golden throne in the Emperor's defense carried obvious symbolic weight, but whether it predicted literal events or represented metaphorical truth remained uncertain. Dante had come to believe, with a conviction that transcended rational analysis, that the vision represented his actual fate. He would serve until called to Terra itself, would stand in defense of the Emperor during some future crisis, and would finally find his death in that service. The belief provided a framework for understanding why he continued to endure when he had long since earned the right to rest. His survival was not accident or simple biological resilience, but purpose, the Emperor, or perhaps Sanguinius's, lingering spirit preserving him for this final duty. The interpretation might be self-deception, a way of imposing meaning on the simple fact that his enhanced physiology had proven exceptionally resilient, but Dante found comfort in believing his continued existence served a purpose beyond mere chance. The weariness went beyond physical exhaustion or even psychological fatigue. It represented a spiritual tiredness, a soul-deep desire for rest that no amount of sleep or respite from combat could satisfy. Dante had been fighting for 15 centuries without meaningful pause. Even during periods when the Blood Angels were not actively deployed, his responsibilities as chapter master continued. He managed the chapter's operations, coordinated with other imperial institutions, oversaw training and recruitment, and handled the 1,000 administrative details that kept a Space Marine chapter functioning. The brief periods of relative peace provided no true rest, merely a shift from combat stress to administrative burden. He had long since stopped counting the battles he had fought, the enemies he had killed, the worlds he had seen. The numbers had become meaningless, statistics that failed to capture the reality of constant warfare across a lifespan that had stretched beyond what anyone had thought possible. He had outlived every warrior he had known during his ascension to chapter master. The battle brothers who had served under him during his first centuries of leadership had all fallen, claimed by battle or the gene curse or simple age. He commanded warriors who had been born centuries after he assumed the Golden Mask, Space Marines who knew him only as the ancient chapter master who had always led the Blood Angels, unable to imagine the chapter under any other leadership. The appointment as Regent of Imperium Nihilus had arrived at the worst possible moment from Dante's personal perspective. He had survived the devastation of Baal, had led the defense that preserved the Blood Angels' homeworld against impossible odds, and had perhaps earned the right to finally lay down his burdens. The Blood Angels had other capable commanders who could assume the role of chapter master. The successor chapters had their own leadership. Dante had given 15 centuries of service to the Imperium and the Emperor. By any reasonable measure, he had fulfilled his duty many times over and could honorably seek the death in battle that would release him from the weight of continued existence. Roboute Guilliman's decision to grant him authority over Imperium Nihilus had foreclosed that possibility. The appointment recognized his capabilities and experience, acknowledging that few individuals in the Imperium possessed the strategic understanding and command experience required to coordinate imperial forces across hundreds of sectors without direct support from Terra. The Primarch's logic was sound from the Imperium's perspective. Dante was the obvious choice for the role, perhaps the only choice given the magnitude of the challenges Imperium Nihilus faced. But the appointment meant continued service, new responsibilities that exceeded even those of a chapter master, and the indefinite postponement of the honorable death Dante had sought for centuries. He had accepted the appointment without hesitation despite his personal desires, recognizing that duty superseded individual preferences regardless of how long one had already served. The Emperor required his continued service, and a Space Marine did not refuse such demands regardless of personal cost. The golden mask that had marked him as chapter master of the Blood Angels would now represent imperial authority across the dark half of the galaxy. The warrior who had wanted only to finally rest would instead bear responsibilities greater than any he had carried before, commanding forces across a region cut off from Terra's light and facing threats that might determine whether the Imperium survived in any recognizable form. the irony was not lost on him. He had survived longer than any chapter master in the Blood Angels' history, had endured when younger and perhaps worthier warriors had fallen, and his reward for this unprecedented service was not the honored death he sought, but greater burdens and extended duty. The visions of Sanguinius suggested this was his fate, that he would continue until called to stand before the Golden Throne itself in the Emperor's defense. Whether that prophecy would prove accurate remained to be seen, but Dante recognized that his service was far from complete. The weight of years pressed down on him with crushing force, his body deteriorating despite the augmetics and life support systems, his spirit weary beyond any rest's ability to restore, yet he would continue because duty demanded it, and because he remained capable of fulfilling the responsibilities thrust upon him. The Great Rift had torn reality itself across the galaxy, a massive warp storm that split the Imperium into two distinct regions with fundamentally different operational realities. On one side lay Imperium Sanctus, the regions that maintained connection to Terra and could still navigate by the Astronomican's light. On the other side stretched Imperium Nihilus, the dark half of the galaxy where the Emperor's psychic beacon could not penetrate and where warp travel had become exponentially more dangerous and unpredictable. Dante's appointment as Regent of Imperium Nihilus granted him theoretical authority over all Imperial forces operating in this isolated region, but the practical realities of exercising that authority presented challenges that made conventional military command seem straightforward by comparison. The most immediate problem was communication. The Astronomican served not just as a navigation beacon, but as a reference point that allowed astropaths to maintain some degree of coherent communication across interstellar distances. Without it, astropathic messages became unreliable to the point of uselessness in many regions of Nihilus. Messages that should have taken weeks to transmit might arrive in days, or might never arrive at all, lost in the warp's turbulence, or so corrupted by the journey that their content became incomprehensible. Dante could issue orders to Imperial forces across hundreds of sectors, but he had no guarantee those orders would reach their intended recipients in useful timeframes or in comprehensible form. The Blood Angels' fortress monastery on Baal became the de facto capital of Imperium Nihilus by default rather than deliberate planning. The location was far from ideal for coordinating forces across such a vast region, positioned in the galactic south rather than any central location that would have allowed more efficient communication with the various sectors under Dante's nominal authority. However, Baal possessed the infrastructure necessary to support the administrative apparatus required for regional coordination, and the Blood Angels' fleet provided the mobile assets needed to maintain contact with distant Imperial forces. The fortress monastery's command centers were expanded and repurposed to handle the intelligence gathering, strategic planning, and coordination functions that Dante's new role demanded. Establishing functional communication networks required innovative approaches that departed from standard Imperial protocols. Dante authorized the creation of relay stations at key points throughout Nihilus, fortified positions equipped with multiple astropathic choirs, and defended by significant military forces. These stations served as communication hubs, receiving messages from surrounding sectors and retransmitting them toward Baal or other destinations. The system was inefficient compared to the Imperium Sanctus's communication networks, with messages sometimes requiring months to reach their destinations through multiple relay points, but it represented a significant improvement over the complete communication breakdown that had initially followed the Great Rift's formation. The relay stations required constant defense against the threats that infested Nihilus. Chaos Warbands recognized the station's strategic value and targeted them for destruction or corruption. Orc raiders attacked them for the simple joy of fighting and looting. Tyrannid splinter fleets consumed them when they fell within the Hive Fleets' advance paths. Dante allocated significant military resources to protecting these communication nodes, recognizing that losing them would blind him to events across entire sectors and cripple his ability to coordinate Imperial responses to emerging threats. Blood Angels strike forces rotated through garrison duties at the most critical stations, with successor chapters and other Space Marine forces providing additional protection at locations throughout Nihilus. Navigation without the Astronomicon presented equally severe challenges. Warp travel had always been dangerous, with ships risking demon attacks, temporal distortion, and simple navigational errors that could leave them lost in the Imperium. In Nihilus, these risks multiplied to levels that made every warp jump a potentially fatal undertaking. Navigators struggled to chart courses without the Astronomicon's reference point, relying instead on local stellar phenomena and psychic landmarks that proved far less reliable. Ships that should have reached their destinations in weeks might emerge from the warp months or even years later, their crews driven mad by extended exposure to the warp's horrors, or their vessels so damaged by demonic incursion that they required extensive repairs before returning to service. The Adeptus Mechanicus provided critical support in addressing these navigation challenges. Tech priests stationed throughout Nihilus worked to identify stable warp routes, paths through the Imperium that showed consistent behavior and relative safety compared to the chaotic currents that dominated most of the region. These routes became the arterial pathways along which Imperial forces could move with some degree of reliability, though even the most stable routes carried risks that would have been unacceptable in Imperium Sanctus. Dante coordinated closely with the Mechanicus representatives, recognizing that their technical expertise and willingness to experiment with unconventional solutions made them invaluable partners in establishing the infrastructure Nihilus required. The establishment of supply lines presented logistical nightmares that consumed enormous amounts of Dante's attention and the Imperium's resources. Imperial Guard regiments required constant resupply of ammunition, food, medical supplies, and replacement equipment. The Imperial Navy needed fuel, munitions, and spare parts for their vessels. Even Space Marine chapters, largely self-sufficient compared to other Imperial military forces, required specialized components and materials they could not manufacture themselves. In Imperium Sanctus, these supplies flowed through established logistics networks that had been refined over millennia. In Nihilus, those networks had collapsed, and new ones had to be built from scratch under combat conditions, while fighting enemies who specifically targeted supply convoys and production facilities. Dante established a network of fortress worlds throughout Nihilus' heavily defended planets that served as manufacturing centers and supply depots. These worlds received priority for military protection and infrastructure investment, their factories working continuously to produce the materiel Imperial forces required. The Adeptus Mechanicus Forge worlds in Nihilus became even more critical than usual, their production capabilities representing the difference between sustained military operations and gradual collapse as equipment wore out and ammunition stocks depleted. Dante negotiated directly with Forge World Fabricators General, offering military protection and priority access to raw materials in exchange for increased production of critical supplies. The convoy system that emerged from these negotiations resembled naval warfare from ancient Terra more than typical Imperial logistics operations. Supply convoys traveled in large groups protected by significant naval escorts, moving along the established stable warp routes between fortress worlds and operational theaters. The convoys faced constant attack from raiders and pirates who recognized their strategic value. Chaos forces targeted them to weaken Imperial military capabilities. Orc freebooters attacked them for loot and the joy of combat. Dark Eldar raiding parties struck at them to capture slaves and supplies. Each convoy's safe arrival represented a minor victory, and the loss of a convoy could cripple military operations across entire subsectors. Coordinating with the Astra Militarum required Dante to navigate the complex command structures and protocols that governed the Imperial Guard. Guard regiments answered to their own command hierarchies, with Lord Generals and Lord Commanders wielding authority over their forces that even a Space Marine chapter master could not simply override. Dante's position as Regent granted him theoretical supreme command, but exercising that authority required political skill and careful relationship management rather than simple orders. Many Guard commanders resented taking direction from a Space Marine, viewing the Adeptus Astartes as elite forces who operated independently rather than as part of integrated command structures. Dante addressed these tensions through a combination of demonstrated competence and respect for guard traditions and capabilities. He made a point of consulting with senior guard commanders before making strategic decisions that would affect their forces, incorporating their expertise and concerns into his planning. When guard regiments achieved significant victories, he ensured those achievements received proper recognition and that the regiments involved received the support and resources they needed. This approach gradually built working relationships with the guard leadership in Nihilus, though some commanders remained resistant to Space Marine authority regardless of Dante's diplomatic efforts. The Imperial Navy presented similar but distinct challenges. Naval officers operated under their own command structures, with fleet admirals wielding enormous power and often viewing themselves as equals to Space Marine chapter masters rather than subordinates. The Navy's culture emphasized tradition and protocol to degrees that sometimes interfered with operational flexibility, and many naval officers viewed the current crisis as temporary rather than the fundamental shift in imperial operations that Dante recognized it to be. Coordinating naval operations with ground campaigns required constant communication and negotiation, with Dante often serving as mediator between Navy admirals who wanted to preserve their ships for decisive fleet actions and guard commanders who needed orbital support for their ground operations. The Adeptus Ministerum's presence in Nihilus added another layer of complexity to Dante's command responsibilities. The ecclesiarchy maintained significant military forces through their orders militant, the Adepta Sororitas, who served as the church's armed wing. These warrior orders answered to their own command structures within the Ministerum, and while they nominally accepted Dante's authority as regent, the practical reality involved extensive negotiation and coordination rather than simple command relationships. The Sororitas brought valuable capabilities to imperial operations in Nihilus, their faith providing protection against chaos corruption that conventional forces lacked, but their presence also brought the ecclesiarchy's political influence and religious agendas into military planning. Dante worked to maintain productive relationships with the Order's militant operating in Nihilus, recognizing their value while remaining wary of the Ministerum's tendency to prioritize religious objectives over military necessity. When Sororita's forces identified heretical activity or chaos corruption, Dante ensured they received the military support needed to purge the threats. When the ecclesiarchy's representatives demanded resources for rebuilding churches or conducting religious ceremonies in active war zones, Dante negotiated compromises that addressed their concerns without compromising operational effectiveness. The balance required constant attention and diplomatic skill that diverted time and energy from purely military considerations. The Inquisition's activities in Nihilus created perhaps the most delicate political situations Dante faced. Inquisitors wielded enormous authority, answerable only to their ordos and ultimately to the emperor himself. They could commandeer military forces, requisition supplies, and demand cooperation from any imperial institution, regardless of that institution's normal command structure. Many inquisitors operating in Nihilus viewed the region's isolation from Terra as an opportunity to pursue their investigations and operations with even less oversight than usual. Some proved valuable allies, their intelligence networks and specialized expertise providing critical advantages against Chaos and Xenos threats. Others caused significant problems, their single-minded pursuit of their objectives disrupting military operations and creating conflicts with other imperial authorities. Dante's approach to managing inquisitorial interests involved careful case-by-case assessment of individual inquisitors and their activities. When an inquisitor's investigation aligned with broader military objectives or identified threats that required immediate response, Dante provided full cooperation and allocated resources to support their work. When an inquisitor's demands conflicted with operational necessities or threatened to compromise ongoing campaigns, Dante negotiated alternatives, or, when necessary, exercised his authority as regent to redirect inquisitorial activities toward approaches that served both their objectives and the broader strategic situation. These negotiations required diplomatic skill and political awareness, as offending an inquisitor could create long-term problems that extended far beyond immediate operational concerns. Planetary governors throughout Nihilus represented another constituency that required Dante's attention and management. These individuals wielded enormous power on their respective worlds, controlling local military forces, industrial production, and the populations that provided recruits and labor for the imperial war machine. Many governors had ruled their worlds for decades or even centuries, accumulating power and establishing local power bases that made them resistant to outside authority. The isolation created by the Great Rift had strengthened their independence, as the difficulty of communication with Terra meant they operated with minimal oversight from the administratum or other imperial institutions that would normally monitor their activities. Dante recognized that maintaining these governors' cooperation was essential for sustaining imperial control in Nihilus. Worlds that turned against the Imperium or descended into civil war represented not just lost territory, but potential resources for the Imperium's enemies. Chaos cults actively worked to corrupt planetary governments, offering power and knowledge in exchange for allegiance to the ruinous powers. Genestealer infestations could subvert entire governmental structures, turning them into unwitting servants of approaching tyrannid Hive Fleets. Orc invasions and other Xenos threats could overwhelm worlds whose governors failed to maintain adequate defenses or refused to request imperial assistance until situations became desperate. Managing relationships with hundreds of planetary governors across Nihilus required an administrative apparatus that the Blood Angels had never needed to maintain before. Dante established a staff of administrators, many drawn from the administratum, but operating under his direct authority, who handled the routine communications and coordination with planetary governments. These administrators tracked production quotas, monitored requests for military assistance, identified worlds showing signs of corruption or rebellion, and maintained the constant flow of information that allowed Dante to understand conditions across the vast region under his authority. The system was imperfect, with communication delays and incomplete information creating gaps in his awareness, but it represented a significant improvement over the chaos that had initially followed the Great Rift's formation. The strategic challenges of defending Nihilus against the countless threats it faced required Dante to think in terms of resource allocation and priority assessment on scales that exceeded even chapter master responsibilities. Every sector faced threats that would have justified significant military response under normal circumstances. Chaos warbands raided across multiple systems. Orc empires expanded their territories through constant warfare. Tyrannid splinter fleets consumed worlds in their paths. Dark Eldar launched slave raids against vulnerable populations. Necron tomb worlds awakened and began reclaiming territories they had held millions of years earlier. The simple reality was that Imperium Nihilus lacked the military forces necessary to address all these threats simultaneously, and Dante had to make constant decisions about which threats received priority and which worlds would be left to fend for themselves. These decisions weighed on him with moral force that pure military calculations could not capture. Every world he chose not to defend represented populations that would likely die or fall into slavery or worse fates. Every military force he allocated to one theater meant other theaters received insufficient support. The mathematics of resource allocation were straightforward, but the human cost of those calculations created a burden that added to the weight he already carried from 15 centuries of service. He made the decisions because they were necessary and because no one else had the authority or information necessary to make them, but each choice added to the accumulated grief and responsibility that pressed down on him constantly. The defensive strategy that emerged from these constraints emphasized mobile response forces rather than static defensive positions. Dante maintained several rapid reaction forces, primarily space marine formations supported by Imperial Navy vessels that could respond to emerging threats across Nihilus. These forces operated along the stable warp routes, positioned to reach threatened sectors within timeframes measured in weeks rather than months. When intelligence indicated a significant threat developing, Dante would dispatch these reaction forces to reinforce local defenses or conduct offensive operations to eliminate the threat before it could grow to unmanageable proportions. The approach could not prevent all Imperial losses, but it allowed Nihilus to maintain some degree of coherent defense despite the overwhelming scale of the threats it faced. The fortress worlds that served as supply depots and manufacturing centers also functioned as anchor points for the defensive network. These heavily fortified planets could withstand attacks that would overwhelm normal worlds, buying time for reaction forces to arrive and providing bases from which counteroffensives could be launched. Dante allocated significant resources to strengthening these fortress worlds, recognizing that their loss would cripple Imperial operations across entire regions. The fortifications included orbital defense platforms, ground-based macro cannons, and defense laser batteries, void shield generators protecting critical facilities, and garrison forces drawn from multiple Imperial military branches. These defensive investments consumed resources that might have been used for offensive operations, but Dante judged them necessary for maintaining any coherent Imperial presence in Nihilus. The psychological impact of commanding forces across such a vast region while cut off from Terra's authority, and the Emperor's direct presence manifested in ways Dante had not anticipated. Chapter Masters commanded their chapters with the understanding that they served the Emperor, and that their actions would ultimately be judged by authorities on Terra. The isolation of Nihilus meant Dante made decisions that would affect billions of lives with no possibility of consultation or guidance from the High Lords of Terra or other Imperial authorities. He answered to Roboute Guilliman in theory, but the Primarch remained in Imperium Sanctus, focused on the challenges that half of the galaxy faced. Practical communication between them was nearly impossible given the warp's turbulence and the vast distances involved. This isolation created a burden of responsibility that exceeded anything Dante had experienced as chapter master. His decisions shaped the fate of Imperium Nihilus in ways that no single individual should have to bear. The knowledge that millions might die because of choices he made, that entire worlds might fall because he allocated forces elsewhere, that the Imperium's survival in this half of the galaxy depended significantly on his strategic judgment and leadership, created pressure that added to all the other weights he carried. He made the decisions because duty demanded it, and because refusing the responsibility would have been a betrayal of everything he had sworn to uphold. But the burden grew heavier with each passing year, as the scope of the challenges became increasingly clear, and the isolation from higher authority became the permanent reality rather than temporary condition he had initially hoped it might be. Dante's leadership philosophy emerged from the intersection of competing influences that shaped his 15th century tenure as chapter master. The Blood Angels inherited from Sanguinius a tradition that emphasized nobility, artistry, and the pursuit of perfection in all endeavors. The Primarch had been a warrior poet, equally capable of crafting beautiful works of art and leading devastating military campaigns. This dual nature became encoded in the chapter's culture, with battle brothers expected to excel not just in combat, but in artistic pursuits that refined their spirits and reminded them of the humanity they fought to protect. Dante maintained these traditions throughout his leadership, ensuring that the fortress monastery's halls continued to display the works his battle brothers created, and that time was allocated for artistic expression even during the most demanding operational periods. Yet Dante tempered this inherited nobility with a pragmatism born from millennia of actual warfare. The Great Crusade and Horus Heresy existed for him only as historical events, studied and revered but not personally experienced. His understanding of warfare came from 10,000 years of grinding conflicts against enemies that Sanguinius had never faced. The Tyranids had emerged from beyond the galaxy after the Primarch's death. The Necrons had been sleeping during the Great Crusade. Even chaos, while present during the heresy, had evolved in its tactics and manifestations across the subsequent millennia. Dante's military doctrine reflected these realities, emphasizing adaptability and practical effectiveness over adherence to idealized visions of how Space Marines should wage war. This combination produced a leadership style that valued both the Blood Angels' cultural identity and their operational effectiveness. Dante never allowed the pursuit of nobility to compromise military necessity, but he also refused to reduce the chapter to mere killers who had abandoned the higher ideals Sanguinius represented. When Battle Brothers created works of art, he viewed this not as distraction from their primary purpose, but as essential maintenance of their psychological health and connection to their humanity. When tactical situations required brutal efficiency over elegant execution, he made those decisions without hesitation, while ensuring that the necessity was clearly communicated and understood. The balance was delicate and required constant attention, but Dante maintained it across his extended tenure with a consistency that became one of his defining characteristics as a leader. His influence on Blood Angels chapter culture manifested most clearly in how the chapter managed its genetic curse. Previous chapter masters had approached the Red Thirst and Black Rage with varying strategies, some emphasizing suppression and control, others accepting the flaws as inevitable aspects of Sanguinius's legacy that required management rather than elimination. Dante's approach combined elements of both perspectives while adding his own innovations developed across centuries of experience. He expanded the chaplain's counseling services, recognizing that psychological support helped Battle Brothers maintain control over the thirst. He authorized increased resources for the sanguinary priest's research into potential treatments, even though centuries of effort had produced no breakthrough cures. He established protocols for identifying warriors at elevated risk of falling to the Black Rage, allowing earlier intervention and support. Most significantly, Dante refused to treat the gene curse as something shameful that should be hidden from the chapter or the wider Imperium. The Blood Angels' genetic flaws were well known among other Space Marine chapters and Imperial authorities, but there remained a tendency within the chapter to view the thirst and rage as failures or weaknesses that diminished their honor. Dante rejected this perspective, instead framing the genetic curse as a burden the Blood Angels bore as consequence of their Primarch's sacrifice. Sanguinius had died defending the Emperor, and his sons carried the scars of that death in their very genes. Managing the curse was not a source of shame, but a demonstration of the Blood Angels' strength and dedication, their willingness to continue serving despite the constant struggle against their own nature. This reframing had profound effects on chapter morale and identity. Battle Brothers who might have viewed their struggle with the thirst as personal failing, instead understood it as shared burden that connected them to their Primarch and their brothers. The Death Company, rather than being viewed as warriors who had failed to maintain control, were honored as brothers who had given everything in service to the Emperor, their final battles celebrated rather than mourned as tragedies. The approach did not eliminate the grief that accompanied each loss to the Black Rage, but it provided a framework for processing that grief that emphasized honor and sacrifice rather than failure and shame. Comparing Dante to other legendary Space Marine commanders reveals both his exceptional qualities and the unique circumstances that shaped his service. Marneus Calgar of the Ultramarines represented perhaps the most direct comparison, another chapter master who had served for centuries and achieved legendary status within the Imperium. Calgar's approach to leadership emphasized strict adherence to the Codex Astartes and the maintenance of Ultramar as a model of imperial governance. His tenure had been marked by defensive victories, most notably the defeat of Hive Fleet Behemoth at Crag, and by his role in maintaining the Ultramarines as the exemplar chapter, whose practices other chapters should emulate. Dante's leadership differed from Calgar's in fundamental ways, despite their mutual respect and successful collaboration. Where Calgar emphasized codex adherence, Dante demonstrated greater flexibility in tactical doctrine, adapting approaches to specific circumstances rather than following prescribed patterns. Where Calgar focused on defending and governing Ultramar, Dante's responsibilities extended across the entire Blood Angels chapter and their network of successor chapters, creating a broader but less concentrated area of authority. The two chapter masters represented different but equally valid approaches to Space Marine leadership, with Kage embodying the ideal of codex orthodoxy, while Dante demonstrated the effectiveness of pragmatic adaptation within the framework of chapter traditions. High Marshal Helbrecht of the Black Templars presented an entirely different leadership model. The Black Templars rejected the Codex Astartes' limitations on chapter size, maintaining a crusading force that numbered several thousand warriors spread across multiple crusade fleets. Helbrecht led this massive chapter through personal charisma and the force of his convictions, his zealous faith in the Emperor driving the Black Templars' endless crusades against the Imperium's enemies. His leadership style was aggressive and uncompromising, viewing warfare as religious duty and showing little interest in the diplomatic considerations that occupied significant portions of Dante's attention. Dante respected Helbrecht's martial prowess and the Black Templars' combat effectiveness, while recognizing that their approach to warfare and chapter organization would not work for the Blood Angels. The Black Templars' zealotry served them well, but left little room for the artistic traditions and cultural refinement that defined the Blood Angels' identity. Their crusading structure allowed them to maintain numbers far exceeding codex limitations, but required constant recruitment and created command challenges that Dante judged unsuitable for a chapter dealing with genetic instability. The comparison highlighted how different chapters developed distinct cultures and operational approaches while remaining loyal servants of the Emperor, each finding methods that worked for their specific circumstances and traditions. The return of Roboute Guilliman and the emergence of other Primarchs from their various fates fundamentally altered the context in which chapter masters operated. For 10,000 years, Space Marine chapters had functioned without Primarch oversight, their chapter masters serving as the ultimate authorities within their organizations. Guilliman's return re-established a level of command authority that superseded even the most senior chapter masters, creating a new hierarchy that placed the Primarchs above all Space Marine leadership. Dante's appointment as Regent of Imperium Nihilus came directly from Guilliman, an acknowledgement that while the Primarch held supreme authority, practical realities required delegating regional command to individuals with the experience and capability to exercise it effectively. Dante's interactions with Guilliman during the Indomitus Crusade and the defense of Baal revealed both the vast gulf between Primarch and Space Marine and the mutual respect that could exist across that divide. Guilliman possessed strategic vision and tactical genius that exceeded even Dante's accumulated experience, seeing patterns and possibilities that remained hidden to lesser minds. The Primarch's understanding of the Imperium's political and military structures came from having helped create them during the Great Crusade, giving him perspectives that no amount of subsequent study could fully replicate. Yet Guilliman also recognized Dante's achievements and the value of his 15 centuries of continuous service, treating the ancient chapter master with a respect that acknowledged his exceptional capabilities even while making clear the ultimate hierarchy of authority. The dynamic between them illustrated the complex relationship between Primarchs and their sons' chapters. Guilliman was not Dante's Primarch, belonging to the Ultramarines rather than the Blood Angels, yet his authority as Lord Commander of the Imperium extended across all Space Marine chapters. Dante served Guilliman's strategic vision while maintaining the Blood Angels' distinct identity and traditions, a balance that required both leaders to respect the boundaries of their respective authorities. When Guilliman issued directives that affected the Blood Angels, Dante implemented them while ensuring they aligned with his chapter's capabilities and circumstances. When Dante made decisions about Blood Angels' operations or the broader defense of Imperium Nihilus, he did so with the understanding that his authority derived from Guilliman's appointment, but that practical realities meant the Primarch could not micromanage every decision. The possibility of Sanguinius's return remained a source of speculation within the Blood Angels and their successor chapters. Unlike Guilliman, who had been placed in stasis, and whose eventual revival had always been theoretically possible, Sanguinius had died absolutely during the Siege of Terra. His body lay in state within the fortress monastery on Baal, preserved but showing no signs of life. Yet the Imperium had witnessed the return of Primarchs thought lost forever, and the warp's nature meant that death did not always represent a final state. Some within the chapter believed that Sanguinius might return, perhaps healed by the Emperor, or resurrected through some mechanism that mortal minds could not comprehend. Others viewed such hopes as dangerous delusions that distracted from the reality that the Blood Angels must continue without their Primarch's direct guidance. Dante maintained a carefully neutral position on these speculations. He neither encouraged hopes for Sanguinius's return nor dismissed them as impossible. The visions he experienced, particularly the recurring dream of standing before the Golden Throne, suggested that Sanguinius's spirit remained active in some form, perhaps capable of manifesting or communicating in ways that transcended normal death. The Sanguinor's appearances provided evidence that some aspect of the Primarch's essence endured and could affect the material universe. Whether these phenomena might eventually lead to Sanguinius's actual return remained unknowable, and Dante refused to base strategic planning or chapter policy on events that might never occur. The Blood Angels would continue serving the Emperor with or without their Primarch's physical presence, honoring his memory through their actions rather than waiting for his return. The prophecy of Dante's death before the Golden Throne had grown stronger in his mind across recent years, particularly following his appointment as Regent, and the vision's increased frequency. The imagery was consistent across the recurring dreams. He stood in the throne room on Terra, the Emperor's shattered form visible on the Golden Throne's life support mechanisms, and enemies pressed against the final defenses. The details varied between visions, sometimes showing chaos forces breaching the Imperial Palace's walls, other times depicting threats that Dante could not clearly identify. What remained constant was his presence there, standing in defense of the Emperor during what appeared to be a final crisis, and the strong implication that he would fall in that defense. Dante had consulted the chapter's librarians extensively about the vision's meaning, seeking their expertise in interpreting prophetic imagery. The chief librarian acknowledged that the visions carried the characteristics of genuine prophecy rather than simple dreams or subconscious processing. The consistency of the imagery, the emotional intensity that accompanied the visions, and their increasing frequency all suggested that Dante was perceiving actual future events rather than symbolic representations. However, prophecy remained notoriously difficult to interpret with certainty. The future was not fixed, and visions of potential events might show possibilities rather than inevitabilities. The throne room imagery might be literal, predicting that Dante would actually stand before the Golden Throne during some future crisis, or it might represent metaphorical truth about his role in defending the Emperor's realm. What the prophecy meant for the Blood Angels and the broader Imperium depended heavily on its timing and context. If Dante fell in defense of the Golden Throne during an immediate crisis, the Blood Angels would lose their chapter master, and the Imperium would lose the Regent of Nihilus at a moment when both positions were critical to survival. The succession planning within the Blood Angels remained incomplete, with no clear heir apparent who could assume Dante's responsibilities with equivalent capability. Several captains possessed the skills to serve as chapter master, but none had demonstrated the combination of military expertise, political acumen, and sheer endurance that Dante's role demanded. The successor chapters would lose the unifying figure who had coordinated their efforts and maintained their connections to the parent chapter. If the prophecy referred to events in the more distant future, its implications became even more complex. Dante's continued survival, until called to Terra, would mean decades or perhaps centuries of additional service, his already unprecedented tenure extending even further beyond normal parameters. His body would continue deteriorating, requiring ever more extensive augmetic support and life-sustaining systems. The psychological weight of extended service would grow heavier, the accumulated grief and responsibility pressing down with increasing force. Yet if the Emperor or Sanguinius's spirit preserved him for this specific purpose, then his survival served a function that transcended personal cost or comfort. He would endure because endurance was required, his death delayed until the moment when it could serve the greatest purpose. The Blood Angel's future after Dante's eventual passing would be shaped by the legacy he established during his extended tenure. His influence on chapter culture, his management of the gene curse, his diplomatic relationships with other imperial institutions, and his strategic doctrines would all continue affecting the chapter long after his death. The traditions he maintained and the innovations he introduced would become part of the chapter's institutional memory, passed down to future generations of Blood Angels who would know him only through records and stories. His example as a leader who served for 15 centuries, while maintaining both effectiveness and adherence to the chapter's ideals, would inspire future chapter masters facing their own challenges and responsibilities. The broader Imperium would remember Dante as one of the greatest chapter masters in Space Marine history, a warrior who served longer than any other and who commanded forces across half the galaxy during one of the Imperium's darkest periods. His defense of Baal against Hive Fleet Leviathan would be studied in military academies as an example of how to coordinate multiple Space Marine chapters in defensive operations. His administration of Imperium Nihilus would provide lessons in managing military forces across vast distances with limited communication and resources. His diplomatic skills in maintaining relationships with diverse imperial institutions would demonstrate that Space Marine leadership required more than just combat prowess. The Golden Death Mask would become synonymous with an era of imperial history, a symbol of endurance and duty that transcended any individual's mortality. Yet for all these achievements and the legacy they would create, Dante himself remained focused on the immediate responsibilities before him. The defense of Imperium Nihilus continued demanding his attention and resources. Threats emerged constantly across hundreds of sectors, requiring strategic decisions about force allocation and priority assessment. The administrative apparatus he had established required constant oversight and adjustment as circumstances changed and new challenges appeared. The relationships with other imperial authorities needed maintenance through regular communication and demonstrated competence. The Blood Angels chapter required his leadership in managing their genetic curse and maintaining their traditions while adapting to the new realities that Primaris reinforcements and the Great Rift's isolation created. He carried these burdens with the same determination that had sustained him through 15 centuries of service, the same sense of duty that had driven him since his selection from the tribes of Baal Secundus. The golden mask concealed a face marked by extreme age and the weight of accumulated years, but it also represented the authority and responsibility he bore as both chapter master and regent. The Ax Mortalis had drunk the blood of the Imperium's enemies for over a millennium, and it would continue serving until Dante's final battle. The Perdition pistol remained ready to eliminate threats that required its devastating power. The Artificer Armor's life support systems maintained his body's functions, allowing him to continue despite the deterioration that age and combat had inflicted. The prophecy suggested his service would end before the Golden Throne, standing in defense of the Emperor during a crisis that would define the Imperium's fate. Whether that moment approached in the near future or remained decades or centuries distant, Dante would continue serving until called to fulfill that final duty. The weariness that pressed down on him, the desire for rest that had grown stronger with each passing century, would remain unaddressed until the Emperor or Sanguinius's spirit released him from his obligations. He had given 15 centuries to the Imperium and would give however many more were required, because duty demanded it, and because he remained capable of meeting the responsibilities thrust upon him. The legacy of the Archangel, Sanguinius's gift and curse to his sons, lived on in Dante's continued service. The nobility and artistry the Primarch had embodied found expression in the chapter culture Dante maintained. The martial prowess and strategic genius Sanguinius had demonstrated in the Great Crusade informed the doctrines Dante employed across his campaigns. The sacrifice the Primarch had made defending the Emperor against Horus created the genetic curse that Dante and all Blood Angels struggled against, a burden that connected them across millennia to their fallen father. Dante's place in imperial history would ultimately be measured not just by his achievements or his unprecedented tenure, but by how well he honored Sanguinius's memory while leading the Blood Angels through an era of darkness that tested everything the Primarch had built. The Golden Mask would eventually pass to another, but the example Dante set and the legacy he created would endure as long as the Blood Angels continued their eternal vigil in the Emperor's name.